Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Night Story, and welcome to tonight's journey toward peaceful sleep. If you're enjoying this content, I would be so grateful if you could take a moment to like this video. I'd also love to hear from you. Please feel free to share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Your kind support truly helps me continue creating these relaxing experiences for you. Now, please make yourself comfortable as we gently begin tonight's journey to restful sleep. I drove out to the Adirondack wilderness in late October 2024, seeking solitude after months of grueling work at the architectural firm. At 34, I had begun to feel the weight of urban life pressing down on me, and the mountains called with their promise of quiet contemplation. The spot I chose wasn't marked on any trail map, just a secluded clearing I'd discovered during a previous expedition. It lay nestled between ancient pines, whose branches were adorned with the fiery colors of autumn, creating a natural sanctuary that seemed to exist outside of time. The drive from Albany took nearly 3 hours, with the last stretch navigated on dirt roads that grew increasingly narrow. My old Subaru complained as it bounced over exposed roots and rocks, but I pressed on, driven by an almost desperate need for isolation. Work had become suffocating. The constant deadlines and demanding clients had left me emotionally drained. This weekend represented more than a casual camping trip. It was an escape, perhaps even a reclamation of myself. As I parked at the makeshift lot near an abandoned ranger station, I noticed how the temperature had dropped considerably. The forecast had predicted mild weather, but a biting chill permeated the air. I zipped my jacket higher and shouldered my pack, which contained everything I'd need for the next 3 days. Tent, sleeping bag, food supplies, and the bare essentials for survival. The weight felt reassuring against my back as I set off down the faint trail that would lead me to my destination. The forest welcomed me with a symphony of subtle sounds, leaves crunching underfoot, distant bird song, and the occasional rustle of small animals darting through the underbrush. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, illuminating particles of dust that danced in the air. For the first time in months, I felt my breathing slow and my shoulders relax. The tensions of city life began to dissolve with each step deeper into the wilderness. After an hour of hiking, the trail narrowed further until it was barely discernible. Most hikers would have turned back, assuming they'd wandered off course, but I recognized the twisted oak that marked the final turn toward my private sanctuary. Ducking under low-hanging branches, I pushed through a dense thicket of bushes and emerged into the clearing. It appeared exactly as I remembered, a perfect oval of open space, perhaps 50 feet across, surrounded by towering trees that formed a natural barrier. The ground was carpeted with fallen leaves in various stages of decay, creating a rich tapestry of reds, browns, and golds. At the center, a ring of stones remained from my previous fire, untouched since my last visit. "Home for the weekend," I murmured to myself, dropping my pack and stretching my arms overhead. The clearing seemed to respond with a gentle rustling of leaves, almost like a whisper of acknowledgement. I attributed the sound to a passing breeze, but something about it tickled the back of my mind. The air was completely still. I dismissed the thought and set about making camp with practiced efficiency. The tent went up quickly, secured against potential wind that the weather report hadn't mentioned. I gathered firewood from the perimeter of the clearing, careful not to venture too far into the surrounding forest as daylight began to wane. By the time I had a fire crackling in the stone ring, shadows had begun to lengthen across the ground, stretching like dark fingers toward my campsite. That first evening passed pleasantly enough. I heated a simple meal of dehydrated stew over the fire and savored it with a satisfaction that far outweighed its actual flavor. The isolation felt therapeutic, allowing my thoughts to wander freely without the constant interruptions of emails, calls, and meetings. As darkness settled completely, I leaned back against my pack and gazed upward at the emerging stars, visible through the circular opening in the canopy above. Yet despite the peacefulness, a subtle disquiet began to take root inside me. It wasn't anything tangible at first, just an awareness that the forest had grown unusually quiet. The nocturnal creatures that typically announce themselves after sunset remained silent. No owls hooted, no small mammals rustled in the undergrowth. Even the wind seemed to have abandoned this place, leaving an unnatural stillness that pressed against my eardrums like a physical force. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps a predator was passing through the area, causing the smaller creatures to hide. Or maybe the unusually cold weather had driven them to seek warmer shelter. Whatever the explanation, I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed, as though the darkness beyond my firelight concealed watchful eyes. Just nerves, I told myself firmly, stoking the fire higher. This is exactly what you came for, quiet and solitude. But as I finally retreated to my tent and zipped myself into my sleeping bag, I couldn't help but notice how the silence seemed to intensify rather than diminish. I lay awake for what felt like hours, straining to hear any sound that might break the oppressive quiet. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my unease, and I drifted into a dreamless sleep. I had no way of knowing that this would be the last peaceful night I would experience for a very long time. Morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Sunlight filtered through the tent fabric, creating a warm, orange glow that momentarily dispelled the lingering unease from the previous night. I stretched within the confines of my sleeping bag, muscles pleasantly sore from yesterday's hike. Outside, birds had resumed their calls, their cheerful notes suggesting that whatever had silenced them the night before had passed. I emerged from the tent to find the clearing bathed in golden light. Dew sparkled on fallen leaves, and tendrils of mist rose from the ground like ghostly fingers reaching for the sky. The scene was picturesque, almost too perfect, like a carefully composed photograph rather than a natural wilderness setting. I shook off the thought and set about preparing breakfast. As I kindled a small fire and set water to boil for coffee, I found my attention repeatedly drawn to the tree line. Something felt different about the forest today, though I couldn't articulate exactly what had changed. The trees seemed to stand more rigidly, their trunks darker against the morning light. Shadows pooled more deeply between them, creating pockets of blackness that the sun couldn't penetrate. "You're being ridiculous," I muttered to myself, focusing on measuring coffee grounds into my portable press. "This is the same clearing you visited last year." Yet even as I spoke the words aloud, I knew they weren't entirely true. The physical features remained identical, the arrangement of trees, the composition of the ground, the shape of the clearing itself. But something ineffable had shifted, as though the forest had somehow become more aware of my presence overnight. My coffee tasted bitter despite the careful preparation, and the granola I'd brought suddenly seemed unappetizing. I forced myself to eat anyway, knowing I'd need the energy for the day's planned hike. According to my original itinerary, I would explore some of the surrounding ridges today, perhaps find a vantage point to photograph the autumn foliage in its full glory. Instead, I found myself procrastinating. I repacked my backpack multiple times, reorganized supplies that didn't need reorganizing, and spent an inordinate amount of time adjusting the guy lines on my tent. All the while, my eyes continued to drift toward the edge of the clearing, searching for something I couldn't name. By mid-morning, the delay had become absurd. Disgusted with my inexplicable hesitation, I forced myself to shoulder my day pack and approach the tree line. The forest trail I'd planned to follow was barely visible, a slight depression in the ground, marked occasionally by broken twigs and disturbed leaves. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I paused, one foot poised to cross the threshold between open space and dense woods. A wave of dread washed over me, so intense it momentarily stole my breath. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, to return to my tent, to pack up and leave this place immediately. The feeling was primitive and overwhelming, the ancient warning system buried deep in human DNA, designed to prevent our ancestors from wandering into predators' territories. I almost obeyed this primal urging. My foot hovered, ready to step backward rather than forward. But then a surge of anger cut through the fear. I was a rational adult, not a superstitious child. The forest was just a forest, trees and earth and wildlife, nothing more. With deliberate defiance, I stepped across the invisible boundary and entered the woods. The change was immediate and disorienting. The temperature dropped several degrees, and the quality of light shifted from golden warmth to a diffuse grayish illumination that seemed to leach color from my surroundings. sounds became muffled, as though the air itself had thickened. Most disturbing was the sensation of crossing a threshold that shouldn't have existed, like moving from one reality into another with just a single step. I stood motionless, fighting the urge to retreat. My heart hammered against my ribs, and sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool air. Logic insisted that nothing had changed except my perception, affected perhaps by lack of sleep or the unfamiliar silence of the previous night. Yet every sense told me otherwise. "This is absurd," I said aloud, my voice sounding flat and lifeless in the dense air. "It's just the forest." I forced myself to move forward, following what remained of the trail. Each step required conscious effort, as though I were wading through invisible resistance. The trees seemed to press closer, their trunks gnarled and twisted in ways I hadn't noticed before. Branches reached overhead, interlacing to form a canopy that blocked most of the sky from view. Time behaved strangely as I walked. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, yet when I checked my watch, barely 20 minutes had passed since I'd left the clearing. The trail grew fainter until it disappeared altogether, leaving me to navigate by instinct through increasingly dense undergrowth. I should have turned back then. In retrospect, that moment, when the last vestige of human passage vanished beneath my feet, was my final opportunity to retreat safely. Instead, driven by stubborn determination and a growing fascination with the forest's oppressive atmosphere, I pressed onward. The trees began to change character as I ventured deeper. Their bark darkened to an almost black hue, and their shapes became more uniform, as though they had been deliberately planted in rows that only became apparent from certain angles. Moss grew thick on the northern sides of their trunks, but it was an unnatural shade of green, too vibrant, almost luminous in the dim light. After what my watch claimed was 45 minutes of hiking, I emerged into a small break in the trees. It wasn't a clearing so much as a slight thinning of the forest, creating a space perhaps 15 feet in diameter. I stopped, grateful for the marginally improved visibility, and took a sip from my water bottle. That's when I saw it. Lying on the ground, partially covered by fallen leaves, was a rectangular object approximately 4 feet long and 2 feet wide. At first glance, it resembled a fallen headstone, the kind found in old cemeteries. But as I approached cautiously, I realized this was something altogether different. The object was made of a material I couldn't immediately identify, not stone or metal or wood, but something that combined properties of all three. Its surface was perfectly smooth, with a subtle iridescence that shifted colors as I changed viewing angles. Most striking was its pristine condition. Despite lying on the forest floor, not a single leaf adhered to its surface, and no dirt marred its gleaming exterior. I knelt beside it, irrationally compelled to touch this anomalous object. My fingers hovered inches above its surface when a sound stopped me, a single sharp crack that echoed through the forest like a gunshot. I jerked upright, scanning my surroundings for the source of the noise. Nothing moved. The forest remained as still and silent as a photograph. But something fundamental had changed in that instant. A shift so profound that it took me several moments to identify what was different. The light had changed. When I'd knelt beside the object, midday sunlight had filtered through the canopy. Now long shadows stretched across the ground, and the quality of light had transformed to the golden red of late afternoon. I glanced at my watch in confusion. 4:47 p.m. That couldn't be right. It had been barely past noon when I'd discovered the object. I tapped the watch face, certain it had malfunctioned, but the digital display remained stubbornly unchanged. Somehow nearly 5 hours had vanished while I knelt beside the rectangular anomaly. I looked down, intending to examine the object again, but it was gone. In its place was nothing but undisturbed forest floor, covered in the same pattern of leaves and twigs that surrounded it. No indentation in the soil, no sign that anything had ever rested there. Panic surged through me, sharp and electric. I spun in a circle, disoriented and suddenly uncertain which direction I had come from. The trees looked identical in every direction, their dark trunks forming a confusing maze that offered no clues about my path. "This isn't happening," I whispered, my voice trembling. "This can't be happening." But it was. Whatever rational explanations I might have constructed, hallucination, exhaustion, a miniature stroke affecting my perception of time, none could account for the overwhelming reality of my situation. I was lost in a forest that no longer behaved according to natural laws, with darkness approaching rapidly. Forcing myself to remain calm, I reached for the compass in my pack. The needle spun wildly, rotating in complete circles rather than settling on magnetic north. My phone showed no signal, and the GPS function displayed an error message I'd never seen before. With no better option, I chose a direction that felt right and began walking briskly, hoping to find my clearing before night fell completely. Each step filled me with increasing dread, as though I were moving deeper into danger rather than toward safety. The forest seemed to respond to my fear, growing darker and more oppressive around me. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm me, I glimpsed a flash of red through the trees. My tent. Relief flooded through me as I stumbled forward, emerging from the forest into my clearing with the desperate gratitude of a drowning person breaking the water's surface. But even this relief was short-lived. As I stood at the edge of the clearing, trying to slow my racing heart, I became aware of subtle changes to my campsite. The arrangement was exactly as I'd left it, but everything seemed slightly wrong. The color of my tent a shade darker than I remembered, the stones around my fire pit arranged in a pattern I didn't recall creating. Most disturbing was the fire itself. I had extinguished it completely before leaving for my hike, yet now flames danced merrily in the stone circle, consuming logs I hadn't placed there. Someone, or something, had been in my camp while I was gone. The realization that my campsite had been disturbed sent ice through my veins. I stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, scanning for any sign of an intruder. The fire crackled innocently, casting dancing shadows across the ground, but the clearing appeared empty of human presence. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and vulnerable in the open space. "Is anyone there?" No response came except the soft popping of burning wood. I took a tentative step forward, then another, moving cautiously toward my tent. Everything looked intact, no signs of damage or theft, but the wrongness persisted. It was as though someone had dismantled my entire campsite and reassembled it with painstaking precision, yet slightly off in ways too subtle to immediately identify. I approached the fire, studying the arrangement of logs. They were stacked in a distinctive crosshatch pattern I never used, creating a structure that burned efficiently but wasn't my style. The stones surrounding the pit had been rearranged into a perfect circle, each one equidistant from its neighbors with a precision that seemed impossible to achieve without measuring tools. My tent zipper was closed, exactly as I'd left it, but the rainfly had been adjusted, pulled tighter, and secured with knots I didn't recognize. My backpack leaned against a nearby tree, apparently untouched, yet when I examined it closely, I found the contents reorganized, not ransacked or stolen, but arranged with unnerving orderliness. "This doesn't make any sense," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. The most rational explanation was that another hiker had found my campsite and decided to be helpful, starting a fire for my return, tidying up a bit. But that didn't explain the missing hours in the forest or the strange rectangular object that had vanished before my eyes. And it certainly didn't account for the profound sense of wrongness that permeated everything around me. As I stood contemplating these impossibilities, the sun slipped below the tree line, plunging the clearing into twilight. The fire's importance suddenly increased as darkness gathered beneath the surrounding trees. I added more wood to the flames, grateful for the light and warmth despite not having built the fire myself. The prospect of spending another night here filled me with dread, but I had little choice. Attempting to hike out in darkness would be foolhardy, especially given my earlier disorientation. My best option was to wait until morning, then pack up and leave this place as quickly as possible. With darkness came a deepening of the forest's silence. Not the natural quiet of wilderness at night, with its subtle symphony of insects and nocturnal creatures, but a profound absence of sound that felt deliberate and watchful. The fire's crackling seemed unnaturally loud against this backdrop, each pop and hiss startling in the stillness. I heated water for a dinner of dehydrated pasta, going through the motions mechanically while my mind raced. The food tasted like nothing, and I had to force myself to swallow each bite, knowing I needed sustenance for tomorrow's hike out. As I ate, my eyes constantly scanned the tree line, searching for movement or shapes that didn't belong. Occasionally, I thought I glimpsed something, a darker patch of shadow that shifted independently, or a momentary reflection of light where no reflective surface should exist. But each time I focused directly on these anomalies, they vanished, leaving me uncertain whether they had ever existed outside my increasingly paranoid imagination. By the time I finished eating, full darkness had fallen. The fire illuminated only a small circle of ground, beyond which lay impenetrable blackness. The stars overhead seemed dimmer than they should have been, as though viewed through a filter, and the moon, which should have been nearly full according to my mental calendar, was nowhere to be seen. I considered staying awake all night, keeping watch by the fire until dawn provided enough light to escape. But exhaustion pulled at me, a bone-deep weariness that seemed disproportionate to the day's physical exertion. My eyelids grew heavy despite my fear, and I realized that fighting sleep would only leave me too depleted to hike effectively tomorrow. With profound reluctance, I banked the fire to last as long as possible and retreated to my tent. Inside, I left my boots on and placed my packed backpack by the door, ready for a quick departure if necessary. My flashlight remained clutched in my hand as I lay down, its beam illuminating the tent's ceiling. Sleep seemed impossible in my state of heightened alertness. Yet it crept up on me unexpectedly. One moment I was staring at the play of shadows on nylon fabric. The next, I was drifting into uneasy unconsciousness, the flashlight still gripped in my fingers. I awoke to complete darkness. The flashlight had died, its batteries drained despite being new. Outside, the fire had extinguished completely, leaving not even a glow of embers. I fumbled for my phone to check the time, but it too had died, despite showing a nearly full charge earlier. Then I heard it. The sound that had likely awakened me. A low, rhythmic rumbling emanated from somewhere outside the tent. It resembled snoring, but with a depth and resonance that no human throat could produce. The sound rose and fell in a regular pattern, interspersed with a wet, sliding noise that made my skin crawl. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as the sound moved around the perimeter of my tent. It would approach from one direction, growing louder until it seemed just inches from the thin nylon wall, then recede and circle around to approach from another angle. The movement wasn't continuous, but happened in discrete jumps, as though whatever made the noise was teleporting rather than walking. My heart pounded so violently I feared it might be audible. Sweat soaked my clothes despite the cold night air, and my muscles cramped from the effort of remaining motionless. The darkness felt alive, pressing against the tent walls with palpable weight. The rumbling stopped abruptly, replaced by absolute silence. This proved even more terrifying than the noise. At least the sound had allowed me to track the thing's location. Now I had no idea where it was, or what it might be doing. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I strained to hear any indication of the entity's presence. Just as I began to hope it had departed, a new sound broke the silence, a slow, deliberate scratching directly above my head on the roof of the tent. I bit back a scream, pressing a fist against my mouth. The scratching continued, methodical and unhurried, moving in patterns that almost suggested writing or symbols being traced. It continued for what my terror-stretched perception registered as an eternity, though it may have been only minutes. Then, without warning, a tremendous pressure descended on the tent, compressing the space around me. The walls bowed inward, as though some enormous weight had settled atop the structure. The nylon fabric strained but remarkably didn't tear. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, trapped in a collapsing pocket of air as the unseen presence pressed down from above. Just when I thought I would suffocate, the pressure vanished. The tent walls snapped back to their normal position with an audible whoosh of displaced air. The scratching had stopped and the rumbling sound had resumed, but now it came from all directions simultaneously, surrounding the tent in a cylinder of noise. I lay there, paralyzed by fear, as the rumbling gradually faded over the next hour. Eventually, a faint lightening of the darkness inside the tent indicated approaching dawn. I had survived the night, though I couldn't comprehend how or why. When enough light filtered through the fabric to see by, I unzipped the tent with trembling hands and peered outside. The clearing appeared normal in the gray early morning light. No footprints around my tent, no signs of disturbance to the ground or surrounding vegetation. The only evidence that anything unusual had occurred was a series of marks on the tent's rainfly. I exited fully and circled the structure, examining these markings with growing horror. They formed no pattern I recognized, not letters or numbers or any human symbol system. Instead, they resembled the tracks left by snails or slugs, but vastly larger and arranged with deliberate precision. The marks glistened in the dawn light, still wet with some clear, viscous substance that I refused to touch. Whatever had visited in the night, it wasn't human, and it had left me a message I couldn't begin to decipher. I broke camp with frantic efficiency, tearing down my tent without bothering to fold it properly and stuffing equipment haphazardly into my backpack. The strange markings on the rainfly seemed to writhe in my peripheral vision, though they remained static when viewed directly. I couldn't bear to pack the tent normally, touching those glistening trails as little as possible as I crammed the nylon into its stuff sack. The morning was unnaturally still. No breeze stirred the leaves. No birds called from the surrounding trees. Even the ambient sounds of a forest waking, rustling undergrowth, distant animal movements, were conspicuously absent. The silence pressed against my eardrums like a physical force, broken only by my own rapid breathing and the rustle of equipment as I packed. I didn't bother with breakfast or coffee, despite knowing the energy would help for the hike ahead. Every instinct urged immediate departure, overwhelming considerations of preparation or sustenance. Whatever had visited in the night might return, and I was determined to be far away when it did. With my pack secured, I faced the difficult question of which direction to take. The trail I'd followed into this clearing 2 days ago now seemed impossible to locate. The forest's edge presented an unbroken wall of vegetation with no obvious path through the dense undergrowth. I circled the clearing 3 times, growing increasingly desperate as I searched for any sign of the route I'd originally taken. "This is impossible," I muttered, an edge of hysteria creeping into my voice. The trail can't just disappear. But it had, or rather, it had been replaced by something else, a subtle alteration to the forest's configuration that erased familiar landmarks and pathways. I was reminded of stories about fairy rings and people led astray by malevolent spirits, tales I'd always dismissed as superstitious nonsense. Now they seemed disturbingly plausible. With no better option, I chose the direction that seemed most likely based on the sun's position and plunged into the woods. The resistance was immediate. Branches that hadn't been there yesterday snagged my clothing, roots emerged from the soil to trip my feet, and the ground itself seemed to tilt subtly uphill regardless of which way I turned. I persevered, pushing through the increasingly hostile terrain with grim determination. My direction became a zigzagging compromise between the path of least resistance and my intended route. Thorny vines appeared with suspicious frequency, forcing detours that gradually led me away from my original heading. After an hour of exhausting progress, I stopped to catch my breath and check my bearings. The forest had changed character again, becoming darker and more primeval. Trees here were massive, their trunks wider than any I'd seen in this region before, their bark blackened as though by ancient fire. The canopy overhead had thickened to near opacity, allowing only occasional shafts of greenish light to penetrate to the forest floor. I reached for my compass. Though I had little hope it would function normally, to my surprise the needle settled in one direction, pointing steadily what I assumed was north. Hope flickered briefly. Perhaps whatever anomaly had affected this place was localized to the clearing and its immediate surroundings. Perhaps I had pushed through to normal forest again. That hope died as I studied my surroundings more carefully. The trees, while massive, were arranged with geometric precision, their trunks forming perfect rows when viewed from certain angles, creating the unsettling impression of a deliberately constructed environment rather than natural growth. The forest floor was too uniform, covered in a layer of dark, damp leaves that showed no signs of animal disturbance. Most disturbing was the quality of sound. My breathing, the rustle of my clothing, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, all seemed muffled and distant, as though reaching my ears through water or thick glass. When I snapped a twig deliberately, the crack was delayed by several seconds, the sound arriving like an echo of an action long completed. I pressed on, using the compass as a guide despite growing suspicion of its reliability. The terrain gradually sloped downward, leading me into a shallow valley where the trees thinned slightly. For a moment, this seemed promising. Perhaps I was approaching the edge of this aberrant section of forest. Then I saw them. Arranged in a loose semicircle about 50 yards ahead were 5 rectangular objects identical to the one I'd encountered the previous day. They stood upright rather than lying flat, embedded in the earth like monoliths. Their surfaces caught what little light filtered through the canopy, reflecting it with the same iridescent quality I remembered. I froze, instinctively ducking behind a tree trunk. Every nerve in my body screamed danger, urging retreat. Yet I remained rooted in place, unable to tear my gaze from the impossible arrangement before me. As I watched, a subtle vibration began to emanate from the objects. It wasn't sound so much as a trembling of the air itself, a disturbance that rippled outward and made my teeth ache and vision blur. The space between the rectangular monoliths seemed to warp and flex, as though the very fabric of reality was being stretched thin. A gap appeared, not an opening between trees or a clearing in the forest, but a literal tear in space, revealing something beyond that my mind couldn't properly process. I glimpsed shapes and colors that seemed to fold in on themselves, geometries that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space, movement that occurred simultaneously in multiple contradictory directions. From this impossible aperture emerged a sound, the same rumbling, snoring noise that had circled my tent in the night. But now it carried harmonics and undertones that conveyed meaning, a language composed of vibrations rather than words. I couldn't understand it in any conventional sense, yet some primal part of my brain recognized it as communication. The gap widened, and something began to emerge. I didn't stay to see what it was. Pure animal terror finally broke my paralysis, sending me scrambling backward and then into a full panicked run away from the monoliths and whatever was coming through that tear in reality. I abandoned any pretense of following a path, simply crashing through undergrowth in the opposite direction, heedless of the branches that whipped my face and tore at my clothing. Behind me, the vibration intensified, resonating through the ground and trees. The rumbling vocalization changed pitch, taking on a quality that unmistakably conveyed pursuit. Whatever had begun to emerge from that impossible doorway was now following me. I ran with the desperate energy of pure fear, my pack bouncing painfully against my back, my lungs burning as I gasped for breath. The forest blurred around me, trees becoming smears of darkness against which I constantly collided. Direction no longer mattered, only distance from the horror behind me. How long I ran, I cannot say with certainty. Time had become as unreliable as everything else in this nightmare place. It might have been minutes or hours before I realized the nature of my pursuer had changed. The vibration through the ground had ceased, replaced by something more conventional, the sound of something large moving through the forest behind me, breaking branches and disturbing leaves with physical presence rather than reality-warping power. This shift from supernatural to natural pursuit should have been reassuring. Instead, it filled me with fresh terror. Whatever had emerged from that gap had fully materialized in this world now, solid enough to interact with the environment as it tracked me through the woods. My strength was failing, my initial burst of adrenaline long since exhausted. Each step became an act of will, my muscles burning with fatigue. I knew I couldn't maintain this pace much longer, yet slowing meant capture by whatever stalked me from behind. As despair threatened to overwhelm me, I glimpsed sunlight ahead. Bright, normal sunlight streaming through a break in the trees. With my last reserves of energy, I pushed toward this promise of escape, bursting through a tangle of undergrowth into a small clearing. Relief washed over me as I recognized where I was, the parking area where I'd left my car 2 days ago. Somehow, my blind flight had led me back to civilization, to safety. My vehicle sat exactly where I'd left it, dusty but blessedly normal and real. I fumbled for my keys with trembling hands, unlocked the door, and threw myself inside. The engine started immediately, its familiar rumble the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. I backed out of the space, tires spitting gravel, and accelerated down the dirt road toward the highway. In my rearview mirror, I caught a final glimpse of the forest's edge. Something moved in the shadows there. Something tall and oddly shaped, its form suggesting humanoid dimensions but wrong in fundamental ways I couldn't articulate. It didn't pursue me onto the road but remained at the tree line, watching as I fled. I drove without stopping for nearly 3 hours, putting as much distance as possible between myself and those woods. Only when my gas gauge approached empty did I pull into a service station, hands still shaking as I refueled. The attendant gave me an odd look, no wonder given my disheveled appearance, torn clothing, and wild eyes. "Rough camping trip?" he asked as I paid. "You could say that," I replied, my voice hoarse from exertion and screaming I didn't remember doing. "Where'd you go? Looks like you tangled with a bear." I hesitated, suddenly uncertain how to describe where I'd been. The name of the forest area seemed to have vanished from my memory, replaced by a blank space I couldn't fill. "Just some woods up north," I said finally. "I won't be going back." He nodded, clearly sensing my reluctance to elaborate. "Some places aren't meant for people to stay long. That's what my grandfather always said." His words sent a chill through me, striking uncomfortably close to what I'd experienced. I mumbled a response and returned to my car, eager to complete my journey home and put this nightmare behind me. But as I pulled back onto the highway, I glanced at my backpack on the passenger seat and noticed something that hadn't been there before. A small, wet smear on the fabric, glistening with the same iridescent quality as the marks on my tent. Whatever had pursued me through those woods had touched my belongings. And perhaps, in some way I didn't yet understand, it had touched me as well. The return to my apartment should have felt like sanctuary. Instead, familiar surroundings only highlighted how profoundly I had changed. I moved through my evening routine mechanically, showering away forest grime, treating the numerous scratches on my arms and face, forcing down a simple meal I couldn't taste. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a stranger, hollow-eyed and gaunt, with a new wariness in my expression that hadn't existed 3 days ago. Sleep eluded me that first night home. Every creak of the building, every distant siren or car horn jarred me to alertness. I left lights burning in every room, unable to tolerate darkness that might conceal what? I couldn't name what I feared might lurk in the shadows, yet the fear remained, visceral and undeniable. When exhaustion finally claimed me near dawn, my dreams were filled with geometric patterns that shifted and reconfigured themselves, forming doorways that opened onto impossible spaces. I woke gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, convinced for a moment that my bedroom ceiling had been replaced by a canopy of black trees. Monday arrived, and with it the expectation that I would return to work, resume normal life as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. I called in sick, unable to face the prospect of fluorescent lights and mundane conversations. My supervisor sounded concerned. I rarely took sick days, but accepted my hoarse explanation of a camping trip gone wrong, a severe cold contracted in the wilderness. That first day alone in my apartment became an exercise in hypervigilance. I found myself constantly checking windows and doors, ensuring they were locked and secure. Shadows and corners drew my attention with magnetic persistence. The irrational certainty that I was being observed never abated, forcing me to close blinds and curtains despite the beautiful autumn day outside. Most disturbing was my backpack, which I'd thrown into a corner upon returning home. The small, glistening smear I'd noticed in the car had grown larger overnight, spreading across the fabric like a living organism. It retained its iridescent quality, shifting colors in different lighting, and seemed to pulse subtly when viewed from the corner of my eye. I should have destroyed the backpack immediately, burned it perhaps, or at least discarded it in a dumpster far from my home. Instead, I found myself oddly reluctant to touch it again, as though doing so would acknowledge the reality of what had happened in those woods. So it remained in the corner, a tangible reminder that my experience had not been hallucination or delusion. By the third day, basic needs forced me outside. My refrigerator contained nothing but condiments and spoiled milk, and delivery services couldn't provide the prescription sleeping pills I'd convinced my doctor to call in. The world beyond my apartment door seemed simultaneously ordinary and threatening, people going about their business, oblivious to the horrors that existed in remote corners of wilderness, yet potentially harboring connections to those same horrors. At the pharmacy, the technician's fingers brushing mine as she handed over the medication made me flinch. The grocery store's fluorescent lighting hurt my eyes, its normal sounds. Beeping scanners, squeaking carts, indistinct conversations, amplified to near unbearable levels. I hurried through my errands, returning home with a profound sense of relief that quickly soured as I realized my apartment no longer felt safe either. The backpack had moved, not dramatically, just a few inches from its original position, but enough to confirm my growing suspicion that whatever substance had marked it possessed agency and purpose. The smear had continued to spread, now covering nearly half the fabric in swirling, iridescent patterns that resembled the markings I had seen on my tent. I approached it cautiously, armed with a kitchen knife I knew would provide no real protection against the entity I'd encountered in the forest. The closer I got, the more the air around the backpack seemed to distort slightly, as though viewed through heat waves rising from hot asphalt. A faint vibration emanated from it just at the threshold of hearing, the same resonant frequency I'd experienced near the monoliths. With trembling hands, I used the knife to drag the backpack into a plastic garbage bag, careful not to touch it directly. The material felt unnaturally heavy, as though it contained something far more substantial than camping gear. Once secured, I carried the bag to my bathtub, the only place in my apartment with a drain that might handle whatever came next. I should have sought help by this point, called authorities, contacted university researchers, reached out to anyone with expertise that might explain what I'd encountered. But who would believe me? What evidence did I have beyond a contaminated backpack and my own increasingly unstable testimony? More likely, I'd find myself under psychiatric evaluation rather than receiving meaningful assistance. So I acted alone, pouring bleach and drain cleaner over the backpack, hoping chemical corrosives might destroy whatever organism or substance had attached itself to my belongings. The reaction was immediate and alarming. The solutions hissed and bubbled upon contact with the iridescent smear, releasing an acrid vapor that forced me to flee the bathroom, coughing violently. When I cautiously returned 10 minutes later, wearing a bandana over my nose and mouth, I found the chemicals neutralized. The bleach had turned clear as water, the drain cleaner reduced to an inert sludge. The backpack itself appeared undamaged, but the smear had changed, contracted into a dense, pulsating mass that glowed faintly in the bathroom's dim light. As I watched, paralyzed by horrified fascination, the mass detached itself from the fabric and moved independently, flowing like mercury across the porcelain surface of the tub. It gathered itself at the drain, then seeped downward, disappearing into the plumbing of my building. I stood frozen, staring at the empty bathtub, trying to process the implications of what I'd just witnessed. The contamination hadn't been destroyed. It had simply relocated, potentially spreading through the infrastructure of the apartment complex. And I had facilitated its movement, perhaps accelerated whatever process had begun in those woods. Sleep became impossible without pharmaceutical assistance. The pills my doctor prescribed provided dreamless unconsciousness, but left me groggy and disoriented during waking hours. I returned to work after a week of absence, moving through my responsibilities like an automaton. Colleagues noticed the change in me, the weight loss, the constant fatigue, the startled reactions to sudden movements or sounds. But I deflected their concerns with vague references to a virus contracted while camping. At night, I began to hear the rumbling again, distant at first, emanating from the pipes in my walls, but gradually growing louder and more distinct. Sometimes it seemed to come from outside my building, sometimes from the apartment next door, sometimes from directly beneath my feet. I couldn't determine if my neighbors heard it too. I'd become too paranoid to ask directly, fearing their answers might confirm my worst suspicions. 2 weeks after my return from the forest, I noticed the first rectangular object in my everyday environment. It appeared on my walk to work, a perfectly smooth, slightly iridescent surface embedded in a brick wall I passed every day. No larger than a playing card, it would have been easy to overlook if I hadn't been sensitized to its particular qualities. I stopped abruptly, other pedestrians flowing around me with irritated glances. The object pulsed slightly as I stared, its surface rippling like disturbed water. When I tentatively reached toward it, my fingers encountered nothing but rough brick, the rectangle visible only from certain angles, insubstantial as a projected image. But it was there. And over the following days, I began to notice others, in the reflective surface of a puddle integrated into the pattern of my kitchen linoleum, hovering at the edge of my vision during my morning commute. Never solid enough to touch, never present long enough to document with my phone's camera, but undeniably real. The forest had followed me home. Or perhaps it had sent an emissary, a fragment of itself that now established a foothold in my world. Either way, I understood with growing certainty that my encounter in the woods had not ended when I fled. It had merely entered a new phase. By the 3rd week after my return, I recognized that ignoring the phenomenon would not make it disappear. Whatever had attached itself to me in that forest was not diminishing with time or distance. If anything, its manifestations were becoming more frequent and intrusive. The rectangular anomalies appeared daily now, often in locations impossible to rationalize as tricks of light or overtired imagination. The rumbling sounds had developed distinct patterns, almost like speech in a language just beyond my comprehension. Most concerning were the dreams that broke through even my medicated sleep, visions of that tear in reality widening, expanding beyond the forest to encompass urban environments. In these nightmares, I watched helplessly as the monoliths appeared in city parks, on busy streets, in the lobbies of office buildings. People walked past them, oblivious to their significance until the vibrations began and spaces between worlds thinned to transparency. I awoke from these dreams with a sense of urgent responsibility. Whatever was happening, I seemed to be the only person aware of it, patient zero in an incursion that defied conventional understanding. If I couldn't stop it, I could at least try to understand it, to document its progression before. Before what? I couldn't articulate what endgame I feared, but the dread remained, constant and gnawing. My search for information began online, using carefully chosen keywords to avoid algorithms that might flag me for psychiatric intervention. Rectangular anomalies in forest, time distortion while hiking, iridescent markings on tent. These queries returned nothing useful, just camping equipment advertisements and articles about optical illusions in natural settings. I expanded my search, exploring forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena and paranormal experiences. Most contained the expected mixture of obvious hoaxes, delusional ramblings, and credulous acceptance of easily debunked events. But occasionally, buried within these digital repositories of the strange and marginal, I found accounts that resonated with elements of my experience. A hiker in the Carpathian Mountains described losing 7 hours while exploring a remote valley, returning to find his campsite altered in subtle ways. A forest ranger in Oregon reported rectangular windows appearing in the woods under his jurisdiction, visible only from certain angles and at specific times of day. A geology student claimed to have found a perfectly smooth stone monolith that disappeared when she returned with research equipment to document it. None of these accounts matched my experience exactly, but together they suggested I wasn't entirely alone in encountering phenomena that defied conventional explanation. I created anonymous accounts to contact these individuals, hoping to compare notes and perhaps find patterns that might illuminate what we had collectively experienced. Few responded, and those who did seemed reluctant to revisit their encounters. The forest ranger had taken early retirement shortly after his report and moved to a desert community where, he told me, the horizon stays where it's supposed to. The geology student had abandoned her studies entirely, refusing to discuss anything related to her discovery. Only the Carpathian hiker engaged substantively, exchanging detailed descriptions of his experience that paralleled mine in disturbing ways. "The forest becomes aware of you," he wrote in one message. "Not like an animal or even a conscious entity, but like an immune system identifying a foreign presence. What happened to us is a response, a mechanism for examining anomalies that appear within its boundaries." His theory, developed over years of obsessive research after his encounter, suggested that certain remote locations served as thin places, where conventional reality overlapped with something else. Not a parallel dimension in the science fiction sense, but a different expression of space-time with its own physics and organizing principles. These places normally existed in stable separation, but occasionally the boundary between them weakened, allowing elements from one side to bleed into the other. "The rectangles are like viewing windows," he explained. "They appear when the separation is especially thin. What lies on the other side isn't malevolent, just fundamentally incompatible with our reality." The danger comes from prolonged interaction. Each exposure makes the boundary between worlds more permeable. His words chilled me, confirming fears I'd been reluctant to articulate even to myself. The increasing frequency of anomalies in my environment suggested the boundary was indeed becoming more permeable, with my unwitting participation as the catalyst. Seeking more structured information, I expanded my research to academic sources. Most mainstream scientific publications offered nothing relevant. Conventional physics and biology had no framework for the phenomena I'd experienced. But in more speculative corners of theoretical physics and consciousness studies, I found concepts that offered at least metaphorical handles for understanding what might be happening. Quantum field theories suggesting reality emerges from interactions between fundamental fields. Philosophical discussions of panpsychism proposing that consciousness might be an intrinsic property of matter rather than exclusive to brains. Anthropological studies of liminal spaces across cultural traditions, places considered thresholds between ordinary and extraordinary realms. None provided concrete answers, but collectively they helped me construct a tentative model for conceptualizing my experience. The forest I'd visited wasn't just a physical location, but a nexus point where the fabric of reality grew thin enough to permit interaction with something beyond conventional understanding. My presence had disturbed this delicate equilibrium, and now the disturbance was propagating outward, following me into the wider world. This theoretical framework offered no practical solutions, however. Understanding the nature of my predicament did nothing to resolve it, and the progressive intensification of anomalies suggested time was running short. The rectangular windows appeared with increasing frequency and duration. The rumbling sounds had graduated from nocturnal disturbances to near-constant background noise, audible even in crowded public spaces that should have drowned out subtle acoustic phenomena. Most alarming were the physical changes I'd begun to notice in myself. My sleep disturbances had progressed beyond insomnia and nightmares to include episodes of unconscious activity. I would awaken to find myself in different rooms from where I'd fallen asleep, sometimes standing before mirrors or windows, staring at reflective surfaces as though expecting them to show something other than my own haggard face. My skin had developed a subtle iridescence in certain lighting, similar to the sheen I'd observed on the monoliths and the contamination that had spread across my backpack. Medical tests showed no dermatological abnormalities, but I knew what I saw, a gradual transformation that suggested the boundary violation worked in both directions. Whatever lay beyond that tear in reality wasn't just entering my world, I was partially entering its. By the 6th week after my forest encounter, I had compiled an extensive digital archive of research notes, witness accounts, theoretical models, and documentation of my own progressively stranger experiences. I arranged for this archive to be automatically emailed to several trusted contacts, colleagues and friends who, while they might not immediately believe its contents, would at least preserve the information should anything happen to me. Because I had reached a terrible conclusion, I needed to return to the forest. Not from curiosity or scientific interest, but from desperate self-preservation and a growing sense of responsibility for whatever incursion I had inadvertently facilitated. The boundary violation had begun there, and if any possibility of sealing it existed, I would need to return to the point of origin. The decision terrified me. Every instinct screamed against deliberately walking back into the place that had infected my reality with something alien and incomprehensible. But the alternative, watching passively as the contamination spread, potentially beyond myself to the wider world, seemed even more unthinkable. I made methodical preparations, approaching the task with the detached precision of someone planning their own funeral. I arranged an extended leave of absence from work, citing medical necessity with documentation from a psychiatrist who had diagnosed me with PTSD from an unspecified traumatic event. I paid bills in advance, set up automatic payments for recurring expenses, and drafted letters to family members to be delivered in the event of my disappearance. Most importantly, I researched protective measures, not from conventional dangers like wildlife or exposure, but from the specific phenomena I had encountered. Folklore and esoteric traditions offered suggestions: iron and salt as barriers against supernatural entities, mirrors to reflect harmful energies, symbolic patterns that allegedly reinforced reality against intrusion from other planes of existence. I had no idea if any of these would prove effective against what awaited me in the forest, but their psychological value alone justified their inclusion in my preparations. Having some form of perceived protection, however dubious, might prevent the kind of paralyzing terror that had overcome me during my first encounter. With preparations complete, I set a date for my return, exactly 7 weeks after my original flight from the forest. The symmetry felt appropriate, though I couldn't have articulated why. Perhaps some part of me recognized patterns in these events that my conscious mind couldn't yet perceive, cycles and correspondences operating according to principles outside conventional understanding. The night before my departure, I stood before the bathroom mirror, examining the changes in my appearance. The iridescence had spread, now visible across my chest and shoulders regardless of lighting conditions. My eyes had developed a strange quality, not a change in color but in depth, as though one could look into them and keep looking beyond what human eyes should contain. "I'm going back," I told my reflection, half expecting it to respond independently. "I'm going to find those monoliths again and what?" I had no concrete plan beyond returning to the site of the original boundary violation. No certain method for sealing the tear between worlds. No guarantee that my presence would do anything but accelerate the very process I hoped to halt. But I had to try. Whatever awaited me in that forest, resolution or dissolution, salvation or transformation, it represented my only hope of understanding what I had become and what I might yet prevent. As I turned away from the mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, my reflection remaining in place for a fraction of a second after I had already begun to move, its expression not quite matching my own. By the time I looked back directly, everything appeared normal again, but I knew what I had seen. The boundary was thinning, not just in the forest or in the world around me, but within me. I was becoming a walking threshold between realities, a human monolith. Tomorrow, I would return to where it all began, carrying this terrible liminality back to its source. What would happen then, I could not predict. But as I prepared for sleep that would surely not come, I found myself oddly calm, resigned to whatever awaited me among those ancient trees and the spaces between them. The drive back to the forest trailhead felt surreal, as though I were moving through a dream landscape rather than the familiar countryside. Colors seemed too vibrant, sounds too crisp, every sensory input amplified to near hallucinatory intensity. Whether this represented an actual change in my perception or merely the heightened awareness of someone approaching a pivotal moment, I couldn't determine. I had chosen to arrive near sunset, timing my entry into the forest to coincide with dusk, that liminal period when day transitions to night, when boundaries of all kinds grow naturally thinner. The parking area was empty when I arrived, no other vehicles present, no signs of human activity. It looked exactly as it had 7 weeks earlier, untouched by the profound strangeness that had transpired within the woods it served. As I gathered my equipment from the trunk, I noticed the first anomaly. a rectangular distortion in the air about 20 feet away, hovering at chest height with no visible means of support. Unlike previous manifestations, which had appeared fleetingly and required specific viewing angles, this one remained stable and apparent regardless of my position. Its surface rippled with iridescent patterns identical to those that now marked my skin. "I see you," I said aloud, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "I'm coming to find the rest of you." The rectangle pulsed once, its colors intensifying momentarily, then vanished with a subtle popping sound that seemed to compress the air around it. Message delivered, acknowledgement received. Though I couldn't have explained how I knew this represented communication rather than random phenomena. With my pack secured, I approached the trail that led into the forest. The path appeared clearer than I remembered, almost artificially defined against the surrounding vegetation. No branches obstructed the way, no undergrowth encroached upon the dirt track. It was as though the forest had deliberately cleared a route for my return, removing obstacles that might delay my arrival. This obvious manipulation should have terrified me. Instead, I felt a peculiar calm descend as I took my first steps into the trees. Whatever awaited me deeper in the woods, it wanted me to reach it without impediment. That suggested purpose rather than malevolence, an entity or force with specific intentions rather than mindless hunger or destructive impulse. The quality of light changed as I moved deeper along the trail, transitioning from the golden hues of sunset to something greener and more diffuse, filtering through the canopy with an almost underwater quality. Sounds became muffled yet simultaneously clearer, each rustle and snap distinct but somehow contained, as though I were hearing them through a medium more substantial than air. Time behaved strangely again, compressing and expanding unpredictably. My watch showed barely 15 minutes had passed when I reached the first significant landmark, a fallen log across the path that I distinctly remembered encountering an hour into my original hike. Yet the journey felt appropriately lengthy, my muscles recording the effort of sustained walking despite the chronological compression. As darkness settled fully among the trees, I activated the headlamp I'd brought, its beam cutting through the gloom with surprising effectiveness. The forest ahead revealed itself in slices of illuminated underbrush and tree trunks, appearing perfectly ordinary within the circumscribed circle of light. But in my peripheral vision, shapes moved that had no place in any natural woodland, angular geometries that defied perspective, flickering presences that registered as absence rather than substance. I continued forward, neither hurrying nor delaying my progress. The sense of being observed intensified with each step. But unlike my previous visit, it no longer triggered fight or flight responses. Instead, I felt a growing certainty that I was approaching something that had been waiting for my return, something ancient and patient and utterly alien to human understanding, yet not inherently hostile. The trail ended abruptly at the edge of a clearing I recognized immediately, the same space where I had camped 7 weeks ago. It appeared unchanged at first glance, the fire ring still visible in the center, the ground still covered in a carpet of fallen leaves. But as I played my light across the area, differences emerged from the familiar tableau. The stones of the fire ring had rearranged themselves into a perfect circle, each one equidistant from its neighbors with mathematical precision. The fallen leaves no longer lay in random patterns but had settled into intricate mandalas that spiraled outward from the circle's center. Most strikingly, the trees surrounding the clearing had shifted position slightly, their trunks now forming a symmetrical arrangement that could not have occurred through natural growth. The forest had reconfigured itself in my absence, imposing order upon chaos, geometry upon organic randomness. And at the center of this transformed space stood what I had come to find, not one rectangular monolith, but 7, arranged in a circle around the fire ring, their surfaces gleaming in the beam of my headlamp. I approached cautiously, sweeping my light across each monolith in turn. They appeared identical at first, but closer inspection revealed subtle differences in the iridescent patterns flowing across their surfaces. These patterns moved with purpose, not random shifting of colors, but deliberate progressions that suggested language or code. As I reached the edge of the fire ring, a vibration began. not emanating from any single monolith, but from the space they collectively enclosed. It resonated at a frequency that made my teeth ache and vision blur, intensifying gradually until it seemed to penetrate my body at a cellular level. The rumbling sound I had come to dread followed, rising from somewhere beneath the earth, filling the clearing with its rhythmic pulsations. I should have fled then, should have abandoned this insane quest and returned to the relative safety of the world I knew. Instead, I removed my pack and set it aside, then stepped into the circle of monoliths, placing my feet deliberately within the stone ring where I had once built a fire. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The vibration synchronized with my heartbeat. The rumbling sound resolved into something almost comprehensible, and the air within the circle took on a visible texture, like heat waves intensified 1,000-fold. The monoliths began to glow from within, their light pulsing in unison, illuminating the clearing far more effectively than my headlamp. I switched off the artificial light, letting the monolith's radiance wash over me. The iridescent patterns on my skin responded, glowing in sympathetic resonance, creating a visual connection between my body and the alien objects surrounding me. I felt myself becoming part of whatever circuit they had established, not a prisoner or victim, but a component, a necessary element in a system whose purpose remained beyond my comprehension. Then the tier appeared. Not between the monoliths, as I had expected, but directly above the fire ring, opening in empty air like a vertical incision in the fabric of reality. It widened slowly, edges peeling back to reveal the space beyond, the impossible geometries and colors I had glimpsed during my flight through the forest weeks before. But now, standing within the circle of monoliths, my perception had somehow expanded to accommodate what lay beyond the tear. I could see it not as chaotic nightmare, but as complex order, a reality operating according to principles that simply differed from those governing my familiar world. The entities moving within that space were not monsters, but inhabitants, as natural to their environment as humans to Earth, their forms dictated by the physical laws of their domain. Understanding flooded through me, carried on the vibrations that now penetrated to my core. Not complete comprehension. Human consciousness simply wasn't structured to fully grasp the totality of what I witnessed, but enough to recognize the nature of what had occurred during my first visit to this clearing. The forest had always been a threshold, one of many places around the world where the boundary between realities grew naturally thin. For millennia, these thresholds had remained stable, allowing minimal transfer of energy and information between domains, maintaining separation that preserved the integrity of both spaces. But something had changed recently. Human activity, perhaps, or shifts in the fundamental forces that maintained cosmic architecture. The thresholds were failing, the boundaries eroding. What had happened to me was not an isolated incident, but an early manifestation of a process occurring across the globe. The entities on the other side were aware of this degradation and had been attempting to address it, to repair the damage before complete boundary failure resulted in catastrophic merging of incompatible realities. My initial intrusion into this clearing had coincided with one of their repair attempts, placing me at the center of a process I couldn't understand. The rectangular monoliths were tools or instruments deployed to reinforce weakened points in the boundary. My encounter with them had marked me as an anomaly, a human who had experienced direct contact with their technology and survived with consciousness intact. The contamination that had followed me from the forest wasn't an infection or attack. It was an established connection, a link that allowed them to study human physiology and psychology through me, to determine whether cooperation might be possible in their boundary maintenance efforts. The progressive changes in my perception, the increasing frequency of anomalies in my environment, all represented their attempts to modify my consciousness gradually, to build a bridge between fundamentally different modes of existence. And now they had succeeded. Standing within the circle of monoliths, I functioned as interpreter and conduit. Human consciousness temporarily expanded to comprehend aspects of their reality while remaining grounded in my own. Through me, they communicated their purpose and predicament. The boundary was failing faster than they could repair it. Their efforts to establish contact with humans, beings who occupied the reality leaking into theirs, had largely failed. with most subjects unable to survive the cognitive adjustments necessary for meaningful communication. I represented a rare success, a human capable of serving as interface between worlds. They needed my help, not just mine individually, but human assistance more broadly. The work of boundary maintenance required coordination from both sides, simultaneous reinforcement of the threshold from their reality and mine. Without such cooperation, the degradation would continue accelerating until catastrophic failure occurred, not apocalypse in the conventional sense, but something more profound and irreversible, the collapse of coherent reality itself. The choice they offered wasn't really a choice at all. Help them preserve the boundary, or watch both our worlds dissolve into chaos as incompatible physical laws attempted to reconcile in spaces never designed for such integration. But how could I, a single human with no authority or resources, possibly facilitate the kind of large-scale cooperation they required? The answer emerged from the vibrations themselves, conveyed not in words but in concepts that unfolded within my expanded consciousness. I would serve as prototype and proof, the first successfully modified human capable of perceiving both realities simultaneously without losing sanity or selfhood. Through me, they would refine the process, making it safer and more reliable for others. I would become recruiter and instructor, identifying suitable candidates and guiding them through the transition I had undergone accidentally. A global network of human assistants working in conjunction with their counterparts beyond the threshold could stabilize the boundaries long enough for more permanent solutions to be developed. The alternative was continued degradation, accelerating anomalies appearing worldwide, and eventual dissolution of the ordered realities we respectively inhabited. As this understanding crystallized within me, the tear above the fire ring began to contract, edges drawing together until only a narrow seam remained visible. The vibration changed frequency, becoming almost soothing rather than disruptive. The monoliths dimmed slightly, their glow settling into a steady radiance rather than pulsing intensity. They were waiting for my response, though I sensed they already knew what it would be. The modifications to my perception had progressed too far for reversal. I could not return to normal human existence even if I chose to reject their proposal. And beyond self-interest lay the irrefutable logic of necessity. Someone had to begin this work, to serve as conduit between worlds that had never been meant to interact yet now required careful integration to prevent mutual destruction. "I understand," I said aloud, my voice sounding strange in the vibration-filled air. "I'll help you." The seam vanished completely, the tear sealed for now but capable of reopening when needed. The monoliths brightened momentarily in what I somehow recognized as acknowledgement, then dimmed to barely perceptible luminescence. The vibration receded gradually, returning to levels that human senses could tolerate comfortably. I stood alone in the clearing, surrounded by 7 rectangular objects that now appeared as ordinary stone markers to conventional perception. But I could still see their true nature, the complex technology disguised as simple monoliths, the patterns flowing across surfaces that ordinary vision would register as merely reflective. My transformation was complete. I remained human in body and largely in mind, but my perception had been permanently altered, expanded to encompass aspects of reality most people would never experience. I could see the boundary between worlds now, could recognize where it grew thin and vulnerable, could identify potential points of failure requiring attention. More importantly, I could recognize others with the potential for similar adaptation, humans whose neurological structure and psychological flexibility might allow them to undergo the transition successfully. They would be rare, perhaps 1 in thousands, but they existed. My task was to find them, to explain what was happening to our world, to guide them through the process I had experienced. Together, we would form the human contingent of a trans-reality maintenance crew, preserving the structural integrity of existence itself until more permanent solutions could be implemented. It was a mandate both absurd and profound, a responsibility I had never sought yet, could not ethically reject. As I gathered my pack and prepared to leave the clearing, I noticed the final transformation. The forest around me, now visible in its true nature, not just trees and earth, but a complex tapestry of energies and information flows, a living system that functioned as interface between incompatible realities. What had seemed hostile during my first visit now revealed itself as simply alien, operating according to principles I was only beginning to comprehend. I would return to human civilization carrying this expanded perception, this terrible knowledge of cosmic architecture under threat. The work ahead would be difficult, perhaps impossible. Identifying suitable candidates, convincing them of truths that defied conventional understanding, guiding them through transformations that would irrevocably alter their relationship to reality. But the alternative was unthinkable. As I made my way back along the trail toward my waiting vehicle, I began mentally composing the narratives I would use, the explanations and demonstrations that might convince at least a few others to join this strangest of endeavors. The boundary needed maintenance from both sides, and I had become its first human engineer. The forest around me seemed to approve, adjusting its patterns to facilitate my passage, guiding me back to the world I would now perceive differently forever. Not with fear or hostility, but with the clear sight of someone who had glimpsed the machinery beneath apparent reality and accepted responsibility for its continued function. 3 months have passed since my return from the forest. Winter has settled over the city, covering familiar landscapes with snow that appears ordinary to most observers, but reveals complex energy patterns to my altered perception. The transformation that began with a chance encounter in a remote clearing continues to develop, my understanding expanding as the entities beyond the threshold communicate through the connection we've established. I've learned to navigate two simultaneous realities, the conventional world of human society and the underlying framework of boundaries and thresholds that separates our domain from others. This dual awareness no longer overwhelms me as it did initially. I've developed techniques for filtering my perception, focusing on ordinary reality when necessary, while maintaining peripheral awareness of the boundary conditions surrounding me. The physical manifestations of my connection have stabilized. The iridescence remains visible on my skin, but has stopped spreading, now covering approximately 30% of my body in patterns that shift subtly in response to boundary fluctuations in my vicinity. I've adapted my wardrobe to conceal these markings when among ordinary people, though occasionally someone with particularly acute perception notices something unusual about my appearance. I've begun the work assigned to me, identifying potential candidates for recruitment into what I've come to think of as the Boundary Maintenance Network. The entities provide guidance, highlighting individuals whose neurological structure suggests compatibility with the modifications required for trans-reality perception. I approach these people carefully, assessing their psychological resilience before revealing even hints of what I've experienced. Most respond with predictable skepticism or concern for my mental health. A few recognize something genuine in my account, perhaps because they've experienced minor boundary anomalies themselves. Inexplicable time slips, glimpses of geometries that shouldn't exist, encounters with places that feel wrong in ways they can't articulate. These individuals become my focus, potential allies in the work of stabilizing reality itself. The process of bringing others into awareness requires delicacy and patience. Unlike my accidental and traumatic initiation, I can offer guided exposure to boundary phenomena, controlled introductions to the vibrations and resonances that facilitate perception across domains. Of the 17 candidates I've approached so far, 3 have begun the transition successfully, their consciousness expanding gradually to encompass aspects of the reality beyond the threshold. Jordan was first, a quantum physics graduate student whose research had already led her to question conventional models of space-time. Her adaptation progressed smoothly, her scientific background providing conceptual frameworks that accommodated the seemingly impossible phenomena she encountered. Within weeks, she could perceive the rectangular anomalies without assistance, could feel the vibrations that signaled boundary thinning in urban environments. Kai followed, an artist whose abstract sculptures had unconsciously replicated patterns from beyond the threshold, suggesting innate sensitivity to trans-reality information. His transition was more difficult, accompanied by perceptual distortions that initially manifested as apparent psychosis. But with careful guidance and support from both myself and the entities, he stabilized into functional awareness. his artistic work now deliberately incorporating elements that strengthen boundary integrity through means I still don't fully understand. Elena came third, a retired anthropologist whose lifetime studying liminal cultural practices had prepared her consciousness for expansion beyond conventional parameters. Her adaptation continues, slower than the others but potentially more complete, her decades of disciplined observation allowing her to integrate new perceptual information without becoming overwhelmed. Together we constitute the beginning of a human response team to boundary degradation. Each brings different skills and perspectives. Jordan's theoretical understanding of quantum fields, Kai's intuitive grasp of reinforcing patterns, Elena's contextual knowledge of how human cultures have historically interacted with threshold phenomena. I serve as coordinator and primary liaison with the entities, my longer experience with trans-reality perception providing a template for their developing awareness. Our work focuses on identifying and reinforcing vulnerable points in the boundary, places where the threshold between realities has grown dangerously thin. These locations occur more frequently than I initially realized, abandoned industrial sites where chemical processes have somehow weakened spatial integrity, ancient ceremonial grounds where millennia of ritualized attention have worn pathways between domains, deep subterranean spaces where the physical architecture of Earth itself creates natural resonance chambers. At each site, we perform interventions designed by the entities and translated through my expanded perception. Sometimes these involve physical modifications to the environment, arrangements of specific materials and geometric patterns that dampen harmful vibrations. Sometimes our presence alone suffices, human consciousness properly attuned, serving as a stabilizing influence on fluctuating boundary conditions. Occasionally, we must facilitate controlled interactions between domains, carefully managed exchanges of energy that relieve pressure building along stress points in the threshold. The work is exhausting and often dangerous. Boundary reinforcement requires sustained attention at frequencies human neurophysiology wasn't designed to maintain. Each intervention leaves us drained, our perception temporarily dulled, our connection to ordinary reality strained by prolonged focus on what lies beyond it. Recovery periods become necessary, days or sometimes weeks, when we retreat from active threshold management and re-immerse ourselves in conventional human experience. During these recovery phases, I continue searching for additional candidates, expanding our network to address the accelerating degradation of boundary integrity worldwide. The entities provide coordinates for priority regions, geographic locations experiencing unusually rapid threshold thinning, places requiring immediate intervention to prevent localized boundary failures that could propagate into larger systemic collapse. Our most recent operation targeted an abandoned research facility in northern Finland, where experiments in particle physics conducted decades ago had created a persistent weakness in local reality. The boundary there had deteriorated to critical levels, vibrations spilling into conventional space with sufficient intensity to affect ordinary humans in the vicinity. Local reports described bizarre acoustic phenomena, unexplained equipment malfunctions, and psychological disturbances among residents of nearby communities. Jordan, Kai, and I traveled to the site while Elena coordinated remotely, her physical condition preventing field operations in such an extreme environment. The facility itself stood in a clearing surrounded by dense pine forest, its concrete structures partially reclaimed by vegetation but still recognizable as a scientific installation. To conventional perception, it appeared merely derelict, abandoned buildings slowly succumbing to weather and time. Through our altered senses, however, it revealed itself as a wound in reality, a place where the boundary had worn so thin that direct visual perception of the domain beyond was possible without technological assistance. Rectangular tiers hovered in open air throughout the complex, some large enough to admit human passage, others microscopic but numerous, like a sieve, allowing constant transfer of energy between incompatible realities. The entities had prepared us with intervention protocols, specific movements, sounds, and mental states that would help stabilize the deteriorating threshold. For 3 days, we worked in shifts, maintaining constant attention on the boundary fluctuations, applying techniques that felt part physics, part ritual, part direct manipulation of fundamental forces through consciousness itself. Gradually, the tears began to close, the largest first, then progressively smaller ruptures, until only microscopic perforations remained. These would heal naturally over time, the entities assured us, now that the major breaches had been sealed. As we concluded our operation and prepared to depart, the facility appeared different through both conventional and expanded perception, still abandoned, still decaying, but no longer leaking reality from its seams. This pattern of identification, intervention, and recovery has become our existence. Jordan maintaining her academic position as cover for research that directly supports our boundary work. Kai incorporating maintenance symbols into installations commissioned for public spaces. Elena developing historical context for threshold phenomena that helps predict future degradation patterns. And myself continuing to recruit, to coordinate, to serve as primary translator between human understanding and the entity's incomprehensible perspective. We are too few, our efforts too limited to address the global scale of boundary deterioration. The entities confirm what I've suspected since beginning this work. The threshold weakening is accelerating despite our interventions, driven by factors both natural and anthropogenic. Cosmic background radiation, shifting magnetic fields, technological developments that inadvertently generate resonance patterns damaging to trans-reality architecture, all contribute to a progressive thinning that our small network can temporarily mitigate but not reverse. More concerning are indications that other entities, different from those I initially encountered, have become aware of the weakening boundary and see opportunity rather than catastrophe in its potential collapse. These opposing forces, the entities term them dissolutionists in concepts that translate poorly to human language, actively work to accelerate degradation, seeking integration of realities that would destroy the coherence of both domains, but potentially allow new forms of existence to emerge from the chaos. We've encountered evidence of their influence. Boundary sites deliberately damaged, rather than naturally degraded, human proxies performing rituals designed to weaken threshold integrity, technology deployed specifically to generate harmful resonance patterns. These discoveries have transformed our understanding of the situation from maintenance project to active conflict, with reality itself as contested territory. The entities have responded by accelerating our recruitment efforts, identifying clusters of potential candidates in regions experiencing heightened boundary stress. My role has expanded accordingly, no longer just recruiter and coordinator, but trainer of trainers, developing protocols that allow successful initiates to guide others through the transition to expanded awareness. Our network now includes 27 active members across 4 continents, with another 42 in various stages of perceptual transition. Each new recruit strengthens our capacity for intervention, but the rate of boundary degradation continues to outpace our growth. The entities estimate critical threshold failure within 5 years without more comprehensive measures, a timeline that lends desperate urgency to our efforts. I've begun documenting everything: the process of perceptual expansion, the techniques for boundary reinforcement, the signs of deliberate sabotage by dissolutionist forces. This record serves multiple purposes: training material for new recruits, evidence for convincing potential allies, and contingency information should our current approach fail. I maintain copies in multiple locations and formats, including one set sealed in a time capsule buried at coordinates known only to the core network members. The personal cost of this work increases as my perception continues to evolve beyond conventional human parameters. I experience episodes of dissociation when boundary activity intensifies, periods when my consciousness seems to exist partly in this reality and partly beyond the threshold. These episodes last longer each time, returning me to ordinary awareness with decreasing completeness. The entities assure me this represents adaptation rather than degradation, my consciousness developing capacity for simultaneous existence in multiple domains, becoming more effective as interface between realities. But I recognize the trajectory leads towards something less than fully human, or perhaps more than human, depending on perspective. Either way, I am becoming something different from what I was before entering that forest clearing. I accept this transformation as necessary cost for the work we undertake. The boundary must be maintained, the threshold between realities preserved long enough for permanent solutions to be implemented. If personal identity becomes casualty of this effort, so be it. a small sacrifice compared to the alternative of complete reality dissolution. Tonight, I sit in my apartment reviewing data from monitoring stations our network has established at key boundary sites worldwide. The patterns confirm what I've sensed directly, a surge in degradation events across all regions, with particular intensity in areas of high population density and technological concentration. Urban centers have become hotspots of boundary thinning, human activity somehow catalyzing the very weakening we work to prevent. Tomorrow we deploy to a new priority location, a metropolitan area experiencing sudden acceleration of threshold deterioration coupled with unusual dissolutionist activity. Jordan has developed detection equipment that functions in conventional reality, allowing identification of boundary stress without expanded perception. Kai has created installation art incorporating reinforcement patterns for public spaces throughout the target zone. Elena has compiled historical records suggesting the area has served as threshold point for centuries, with local folklore describing phenomena consistent with boundary permeability. I will coordinate on site, directly engaging with local manifestations of trans-reality entities while guiding our human team through precisely calculated interventions. The operation carries significant risk, the highest concentration of boundary anomalies we've yet encountered in an urban environment, combined with confirmed dissolutionist presence working actively against our efforts. But risk has become constant companion in this strange existence I now inhabit. Since that September day when I drove to a forest seeking solitude and found instead a tear in reality, nothing has remained certain except the necessity of the work itself. The boundary must be maintained, the threshold preserved, reality kept coherent enough for life to continue its complex dance of existence. As I prepare for tomorrow's operation, checking equipment and reviewing protocols, I find myself reflecting on the person I was before entering that clearing. An ordinary human with ordinary concerns, unaware of the cosmic architecture supporting everyday existence. That person is gone, transformed by encounter with something beyond conventional understanding into something neither fully human nor fully other. What remains is purpose, clarity regarding the work that must be done. The boundary calls for maintenance, the threshold requires reinforcement, reality itself needs defenders conscious of its fragility. Whatever I am becoming serves that necessity, and in that service I find meaning transcending individual identity or conventional existence. The forest changed me, initiating a transformation that continues with each threshold encountered, each boundary reinforced, each new recruit brought into awareness of trans-reality conditions. I am becoming interface and instrument, human consciousness expanded to perceive and interact with forces beyond ordinary comprehension. Tomorrow brings another opportunity to fulfill that purpose. Another boundary site requiring intervention, another threshold to reinforce against forces of dissolution. I will meet it with the strange calm that has replaced fear in my expanded awareness, the certainty that comes from glimpsing the machinery beneath apparent reality and accepting responsibility for its continued function. The boundary must be maintained, the work continues, and I with it, changed but resolute, transformed but determined, no longer the person who entered that forest clearing, but something necessary for the preservation of reality itself. I felt the biting wind lash across my face as I stepped out of my truck at the ranger station. The pre-dawn air carried a bitter chill that seemed to whisper warnings through the towering pines surrounding the outpost. My name is Alex Reeves, and on that morning in October 2015, I had no idea that my life would forever be changed by what awaited in the dense wilderness of Cibola National Forest. The call had come just after 4 a.m., jarring me from a restless sleep. The dispatcher's voice was tense, clinically professional, but unable to mask a tremor of concern that immediately set me on edge. "We've got a possible Code 16 near the Eastern Ridge Trail," she said. Campers reported finding a destroyed campsite with signs of violence. "Animal attack?" I asked, already pulling on my boots. A pause. They weren't sure. Said it looked wrong. Too deliberate. By the time I pulled into the gravel lot of our station headquarters, the sky was just beginning to lighten at the edges. 2 other vehicles were already parked, Sam's mud-spattered Jeep and Supervisor Bridges' government-issue SUV. I grabbed my pack from the passenger seat and hurried inside. The station was a simple timber frame building, mostly utilitarian, with maps covering the walls and a large central table where we conducted briefings. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the room, making the concerned faces around the table look gaunt and severe. Sam Morrison nodded as I entered. She was relatively new to search and rescue, only about 8 months in, but she'd proven herself capable in several difficult operations. Her usual easygoing demeanor was replaced by a tight-lipped expression as she studied a topographical map spread out on the table. "Alex?" Supervisor Bridges acknowledged me with a grim nod. He was a seasoned veteran of the Forest Service with 20-plus years under his belt. His weathered face told stories of countless rescues, though I'd never seen him look quite this unsettled. "Glad you made it. We're heading out as soon as Kit arrives." "What are we looking at?" I asked, setting my pack down and joining them at the table. Bridges pushed a printed sheet toward me. "Missing hiker. Brian Vasquez, 41, from Albuquerque. Experienced outdoorsman with multiple solo hikes in his history. Family reported him overdue yesterday evening when he missed his check-in call." I scanned the paper. Average height and build, dark hair, full beard. The usual equipment list for a 3-day solo trek. "So what's got everyone looking like they've seen a ghost?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. Sam didn't smile. Instead, she turned her phone toward me. "Campers sent these to dispatch before we lost contact with them." The first photo showed a campsite in complete disarray, not the kind of mess a bear might make while searching for food, but something more systematic and disturbing. The tent had been shredded, not torn or clawed, but precisely cut into ribbons. Equipment was scattered in an almost deliberate pattern. The second photo made my stomach clench. A hiking boot, split open like a cracked egg, with dark stains soaking into the surrounding dirt. "Jesus," I muttered. "The couple who found this said they heard something moving in the brush while they were taking these pictures," Sam continued. "They tried to call it in directly from the site but lost signal. They hiked back to their car and drove to the ranger station at Sandoval Ridge to report it in person." The door swung open, bringing a gust of cold air as Kit Chen, our medical specialist, hurried in. He nodded to us, already suited up in his gear. "Sorry I'm late. Had to grab extra supplies." He patted his oversized medical pack. "Based on the report, I thought we might need the trauma kit." Bridges nodded. "All right, team. Here's what we know. Brian Vasquez was last seen 3 days ago at the East Ridge trailhead. His planned route would have taken him along this ridge." He traced a line across the map, with his campsite scheduled for this clearing near Blackwater Creek. Sam pointed to a spot about 2 miles northeast of the marked campsite. "This is where the destroyed camp was found." "Off his intended route," I noted. "Yes," Bridges confirmed, "which either means he changed plans, got lost, or someone or something moved him." Kit finished quietly. The implication hung in the air, nobody wanting to address it directly. In my 2 years with search and rescue, we'd dealt with animal attacks, exposure deaths, even the occasional suicide. But this felt different. The deliberate nature of the destruction in the photos suggested something more calculated. "The local sheriff has been notified," Bridges continued. "They're sending a deputy to coordinate, but they're short-staffed with that multi-car accident on the highway. For now, it's just us. We move in pairs. Radio check-ins every 15 minutes. If you spot anything unusual, and I mean anything, you call it in immediately." We gathered our equipment, checking batteries and radios and flashlights. I secured my sidearm in its holster, standard issue for potential wildlife encounters, though I'd never needed to draw it outside of training. "Alex, you're with Sam," Bridges directed. "Kit and I will approach from the north side. If this is a wildlife situation, we need to be prepared for an injured hiker and possible predator tracking." As we loaded into the vehicles, the sun finally crested the mountain ridge, painting the forest in deceptively peaceful golden light. Sam slid into the passenger seat beside me, her expression tense but resolute. "What do you think happened out there?" she asked, as we pulled onto the access road that would take us to the trailhead. I kept my eyes on the winding road, watching for ice patches in the early morning shadows. Probably a mountain lion, maybe a bear, though they should be preparing to den up this time of year. "Those pictures didn't look like any animal attack I've ever seen," Sam said quietly, staring out at the passing trees. I didn't respond. She was right, and we both knew it. The drive to the eastern trailhead took 40 minutes of tense silence. As we parked and gathered our gear, the forest seemed preternaturally quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the occasional moan of wind through the pines and the crunch of our boots on frost-covered ground. "Stay close," I told Sam as we started down the trail, following Bridges and Kit. "Keep your eyes and ears open." Something about the silence of the forest made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Whatever had happened to Brian Vasquez, I had a sinking feeling we were walking straight toward it. The trail narrowed as we pressed deeper into the forest, the packed dirt path giving way to rocky terrain dotted with twisted roots and slippery patches of fallen pine needles. Our breath formed clouds in the cold morning air as we followed Bridges' lead, carefully marking our position on GPS units as we moved. 2 miles to the reported site, Kit said, checking his device. "Should reach it in about 40 minutes at this pace." The further we hiked, the more oppressive the silence became. Cibola National Forest was typically alive with sound, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the distant yip of coyotes. Today there was nothing but the whisper of the wind and the crunch of our footsteps. "It's too quiet," Sam murmured, echoing my thoughts. "Where are all the animals?" "Maybe they sense something we don't," I replied, trying to keep my voice level. "Wildlife has better instincts than we do." Sam nodded but drew closer to me as we walked. I didn't blame her. The absence of sound was more unnerving than any noise could have been. About a mile in, Bridges stopped abruptly, crouching to examine something on the ground. We gathered around him, looking at what had caught his attention. A single hiking boot print pressed into a patch of mud, accompanied by strange, elongated marks on either side. "That's odd," Kit said, bending closer. "Those look almost like drag marks?" Bridges ran his fingers along the impression without touching it. "Could be someone using hiking poles, but the pattern is wrong. And look at the depth of this print. It's deeper than it should be, even accounting for the mud." "Like he was carrying something heavy," I suggested. "Or being pulled down." We all exchanged uneasy glances. Bridges took a photo of the print and marked the location on his GPS. "Keep moving, but stay alert," he instructed. "Radio check every 10 minutes now instead of 15. As we continued, similar prints appeared with increasing frequency. Some showed a normal gait, while others displayed that same dragging quality, as though Brian had been struggling to walk or being forced along. The temperature seemed to drop with each step forward, though the sun now rose high enough to penetrate the canopy in dappled patches of light. "There," Sam pointed ahead suddenly. "I think I see something." About 50 yards ahead, a flash of bright fabric was visible among the brown and green of the forest floor. We approached cautiously, and my stomach tightened as the scene came into focus. It was a backpack, or rather, what remained of one. The sturdy nylon material had been shredded, its contents scattered across a 10-foot radius. Energy bar wrappers, a crushed water bottle, torn maps, a broken compass. The destruction looked purposeful, methodical even, as though someone had carefully dismantled every item. "This is definitely Brian's," Kit confirmed, examining a medication bottle with Vasquez's name on the label. "Prescription allergy meds." I circled the area, scanning the ground for tracks or signs of struggle. "No blood," I noted. "At least not here." "That's something," Sam said, though her voice didn't sound relieved. Bridges was examining the pattern of the scattered items, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "This isn't random," he said finally. "Look at the way these things are laid out. It's almost deliberate." He was right. The items formed a rough circle, with the shredded backpack at its center. Not the chaotic scatter of an animal rummaging for food, but something more intentional. "What would do this?" Sam asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. There was no good answer to give. Kit knelt to examine a torn jacket, holding it up to show long, clean cuts along the seams. These weren't torn. They were cut, with something sharp. A cold knot formed in my stomach. So we're not looking for an animal. I didn't say that, Kit replied, his eyes meeting mine with an unspoken concern. Bridges keyed his radio. Base, this is Search Team 1. We've located the hiker's belongings at coordinates Echo 357. No sign of the subject yet, but evidence of unusual activity. Request Sheriff's Deputy expedite to our location. The radio crackled with static before the response came through. Copy that, Search Team 1. Sheriff's Department advises deputy is delayed. ETA now approximately 2 hours. Proceed with caution. Bridges grimaced. Copy. We'll update as situation develops. Out. He turned to us. We continue the search, but we stay together now. No splitting up. The campsite should be about half a mile ahead, according to the camper's report, I said, checking my map. Then that's where we're headed, Bridges decided. Pack up anything with identifying information for the investigation. Leave the rest as is for the Sheriff's Department. We collected Brian's ID, his medication, and a few personal items before continuing along the trail. The atmosphere had shifted from professional concern to a creeping dread that none of us wanted to acknowledge. Whatever had happened here went beyond the usual mishaps we dealt with in search and rescue. The path began to slope downward, leading us into a shallow ravine where the trees grew denser and sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy. The temperature dropped noticeably as we descended, our breath now forming thicker clouds in the air. Should be just ahead, Kit murmured, checking his GPS. We rounded a bend in the trail and stopped abruptly. The ravine opened into a small clearing, and in its center stood what remained of a campsite, though remained was perhaps too generous a word. The tent lay in ribbons, the fabric shredded with the same careful precision we'd seen on the backpack. The aluminum poles had been bent and twisted into unnatural angles, some driven into the ground like stakes. A sleeping bag had been meticulously unzipped and then cut along its seams, spread out on the ground like a dissected specimen. Cooking utensils were arranged in a perfect line, ordered by size. But it was the blood that commanded our attention. Dark stains splattered across the clearing in no natural pattern, some of it soaked into the ground, some of it smeared in strange angular marks on the surrounding tree trunks. That's not animal behavior, Sam said, her voice tight. Bridges drew his sidearm. Everyone stay alert. Kit, can you determine if this blood is fresh? Kit approached cautiously, kneeling beside one of the larger stains. He carefully touched a gloved finger to the edge. Tacky, not completely dried. Within the last 24 hours, I'd say. I scanned the tree line, suddenly acutely aware of being watched. The feeling was so intense I nearly drew my weapon, but there was nothing visible among the shadowed pines. Look, Sam pointed to the ground at the far edge of the clearing. Tracks. We crossed to her position, careful not to disturb any potential evidence. 2 sets of footprints led away from the camp, one clearly made by hiking boots, Brian's presumably, and another set alongside them that made my skin crawl. The second set of prints wasn't human, nor did they match any wildlife I'd encountered in my years of backcountry work. They were elongated, with strange protrusions at what would be the toe area, and they pressed unusually deep into the soil, suggesting significant weight. Most disturbing was their gait. The stride was too long, the placement too precise. What the hell made these? I muttered. Bridges studied them intently. I don't know, but they're leading away from the camp. And if Brian was with whatever made them, that's the direction we need to go. Are you sure? Sam asked, unable to hide the apprehension in her voice. Our job is to find Brian, Bridges replied firmly. Whatever did this, we'll deal with that when we have to. I nodded, though my instincts screamed at me to turn back. They're heading northeast toward Blackwater Creek. Then so are we, Bridges decided. Weapons ready, formation tight. Alex, you take point. Kit, you're on medical standby. Sam, keep your eyes on our 6. As we followed the tracks away from the destroyed camp, I couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness that permeated the forest. The wind had picked up, carrying a sour, metallic scent that caught in the back of my throat. Above us, dark clouds gathered, promising an early dusk and the possibility of snow. Radio check, Bridges instructed as we moved deeper into the trees. One by one, we confirmed our radios were functioning, though static interference seemed to be increasing the further we went. The tracks led us along a game trail that grew increasingly steep and treacherous, forcing us to slow our pace. "Blood here," Kit called suddenly, pointing to dark splashes on a fallen log. I examined the stains, while the others secured our perimeter. "Still tacky. We're not far behind." "Behind what exactly?" Sam asked, voicing the question we'd all been avoiding. "Let's focus on finding Brian," Bridges responded, though his grim expression suggested he was considering the same unsettling possibilities we all were. We pressed on, the forest growing denser and darker with each step. The tracks continued, showing signs that Brian had begun to stumble, his footprints becoming irregular, sometimes sliding in the dirt. The other prints remained eerily consistent, never faltering or changing pace. About a half-mile from the campsite, we found Brian's second boot, torn open like the first one we'd seen in the photos. Nearby, strips of what appeared to be his shirt hung from a low branch, fluttering in the rising wind like grotesque flags. "He's losing clothes as he moves," I observed. "Not good in these temperatures." "If he's still," Sam started but cut herself off. "He's still alive until we know otherwise," Bridges stated firmly. "That's how we operate." A faint sound reached us then, so subtle at first that I thought I'd imagined it. But when I raised my hand for silence, the others heard it too. A scraping noise like something heavy being dragged across stone, coming from somewhere ahead. "Move," Bridges whispered. "Carefully." We advanced through the underbrush, no longer following the trail but moving toward the source of the sound. It grew louder, interrupted occasionally by a wet, grinding noise that set my teeth on edge. As we approached a dense thicket of young pines, the sounds abruptly stopped. Complete silence fell once more, but this time it felt expectant, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. "Something's there," Kit mouthed silently, pointing toward the thicket. I raised my weapon, focusing on the shadows between the trees. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, almost imperceptibly, a shadow shifted, not cast by branches or leaves, but something solid and wrong, its proportions subtly distorted in ways my mind struggled to process. "Brian Vasquez?" Bridges called out, his voice steady despite the tension. "This is Forest Service Search and Rescue. We're here to help you." No response came, but the shadow seemed to gather itself, becoming more defined against the backdrop of trees. It was roughly human-sized but impossibly thin, with limbs that appeared too long and jointed in all the wrong places. "Step out slowly," Bridges continued, his sidearm raised. "We need to get you to safety." The shape moved then, not stepping forward as requested, but withdrawing deeper into the thicket with a strange, fluid motion that reminded me of an insect retreating into a crevice. The branches rustled, and then it was gone, leaving only disturbed vegetation and that lingering, sour scent. "What the hell was that?" Sam breathed. Before anyone could answer, a strangled cry echoed from beyond the thicket, human, filled with pain and terror. "Brian!" Kit shouted, already moving toward the sound. "Wait!" I grabbed his arm. "We go together!" We crashed through the thicket as a unit, weapons drawn, calling Brian's name. The undergrowth gave way to a rocky slope leading down to a shallow stream. The cry came again, weaker this time, from somewhere near the water's edge. And there, crumpled against a boulder at the stream's edge, we found Brian Vasquez. Brian Vasquez lay in a twisted heap against the moss-covered boulder, his body contorted in a way that immediately told me something was very wrong. He wore only the tattered remains of his pants, his upper body exposed to the cold and covered in a network of precise, shallow cuts that reminded me of a grotesque anatomical diagram. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. "He's alive!" Kit pushed past me, medical pack already open, as he dropped to his knees beside Brian. "Secure the area," Bridges ordered sharply. "Whatever did this could still be nearby." Sam and I moved into defensive positions while Kit assessed Brian's condition. The rocky slope gave us decent visibility in most directions, but the dense underbrush along the stream bank provided too many places for something to hide. "Can you hear me, Brian?" Kit asked, carefully checking vital signs. "You're safe now. We're search and rescue." Brian's eyes fluttered open, wild, unfocused, dilated with terror. His lips moved, but only a hoarse rattle emerged. "Don't try to talk," Kit soothed, pulling out an emergency blanket to cover Brian's exposed skin. "We're going to get you out of here." "Situation?" Bridges asked tersely, keeping his gaze fixed on the surrounding forest. Kit's expression was grim. "Multiple lacerations, signs of hypothermia, possible internal injuries. He needs immediate evacuation." Bridges nodded and keyed his radio. "Base, this is Search Team 1. We've located Brian Vasquez, alive but in critical condition. Requesting immediate medevac to our coordinates." The radio crackled, the static worse than before. The voice that responded was broken and difficult to understand. "Copy. Unable to. Helicopter. Weather system. ETA 4 hours." "Repeat last transmission," Bridges demanded. "You're breaking up." The radio hissed again. "Storm front. Helicopters grounded. Sending ground team. 4 hours minimum." Bridges cursed under his breath. "Copy that. We'll stabilize and prepare for transport. Out." He turned to us. "Helicopter evacuation is a no-go. Weather's turning bad, and they can't risk flying in these conditions. Ground team won't reach us for at least 4 hours." "He might not have 4 hours," Kit said quietly, continuing to work on Brian's injuries. I scanned the darkening sky visible through the canopy. Heavy clouds had rolled in, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. "We need to move him to a more defensible position and set up emergency shelter." "Agreed," Bridges nodded. "There's a Park Service cabin about a mile northeast of here. Basic supplies, solid walls. If we can get him there, we stand a better chance of keeping him stable until help arrives." Brian suddenly seized Kit's wrist with surprising strength, his eyes clearing momentarily. "Not human," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "It studies." "Save your strength," Kit urged, gently trying to loosen Brian's grip. But Brian was desperate to communicate. "Watches, learns, takes apart to understand." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold. "What takes apart, Brian?" I asked, moving closer. "What did this to you?" His eyes locked onto mine with terrifying lucidity. "Shadow, wrong angles, patient hunter." His gaze darted to the trees behind me. "Still, watching." I spun around, scanning the forest edge, and for a brief moment I could have sworn I saw that same distorted silhouette from before. A too thin figure with 2 long limbs, observing us from the shadows between distant pines. When I blinked, it was gone. "We need to move. Now," I said, turning back to the others. "Can we transport him?" Kit nodded reluctantly. "If we're careful. I've stabilized the worst of the bleeding, but he has multiple fractures and possible spinal injuries." "We'll use the collapsible stretcher," Bridges decided. "Sam, Alex, help Kit prepare him for transport. I'll keep watch." We worked quickly, securing Brian to the lightweight emergency stretcher from Kit's pack. Each movement drew pained gasps from him, despite Kit's administration of the strongest painkillers in our medical kit. As we prepared to move, Brian drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally muttering fragments that made little sense but raised the hairs on my arms. Methodical, curious, not hunting for food. "Conserve your energy," Kit told him each time, checking his pulse with increasing concern. With Brian secured, we began the difficult task of carrying him across the uneven terrain. Bridges took the lead, with Sam and me carrying the stretcher and Kit following close behind, continuously monitoring Brian's condition. The going was slow and treacherous, the path climbing steeply away from the stream before leveling out into denser forest. About 20 minutes into our journey, a low, guttural sound stopped us in our tracks. Not quite a growl, not quite a mechanical whine, but something unsettlingly between the two. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Move faster," Bridges ordered quietly. We picked up our pace as much as the rough terrain would allow, the weight of the stretcher digging into my shoulders and arms. The forest around us had grown noticeably darker as the storm clouds thickened overhead, and an oppressive stillness had fallen, broken only by our labored breathing and the occasional moan from Brian. The cabin appeared ahead just as the first fat snowflakes began to fall, a simple wooden structure nestled among the pines, used mainly by Forest Service personnel during surveys and maintenance operations. Bridges hurried ahead to clear the building while Sam and I waited with Kit and Brian. "Clear!" Bridges called after a moment, and we rushed forward, carefully maneuvering the stretcher through the narrow doorway. The interior was basic but sufficient: a wood stove, 2 bunks, a table with chairs, and cabinets stocked with emergency supplies. We transferred Brian to one of the bunks while Kit immediately resumed treatment, pulling additional supplies from the cabin's first aid kit. "Sam, get a fire started," Bridges directed. "Alex, help me secure the perimeter." I followed Bridges outside, where the snow was beginning to fall more heavily. We quickly checked around the cabin's exterior, ensuring all windows were intact and shuttered. The surrounding forest had disappeared into a wall of white as the storm intensified. "At least the weather might slow down whatever's out there," I remarked, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Bridges gave me a measured look. "Don't count on it. Whatever we saw back there, I've been in these forests for 20 years, and I've never encountered anything like it." "You don't think it's human," I said. It wasn't a question. "I think we need to be prepared for anything," he replied carefully. "Check the tool shed around back. Anything we can use to reinforce the doors and windows." I nodded and made my way to the small shed attached to the rear of the cabin. Inside, I found basic tools: axes, saws, shovels, along with extra firewood and building materials. I gathered what looked most useful and returned to the cabin just as the storm unleashed its full fury, the wind howling through the trees like a living thing. Inside, Sam had a fire going in the wood stove, filling the small space with blessed warmth. Kit worked intently over Brian, who had fallen into what appeared to be a restless unconsciousness, his body occasionally twitching as though fighting invisible restraints. "How is he?" I asked, setting down my gathered supplies. Kit shook his head. "Not good. He's lost a lot of blood, and he's showing signs of infection already, which shouldn't be possible this quickly. And these cuts—" He gestured to the network of lacerations covering Brian's body. "They're not random. They follow muscle groups, nerve pathways, almost like dissection guidelines." A heavy silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the moaning of the wind outside. "We need to barricade the doors and windows," Bridges said finally. "Use whatever we have. That thing could still be tracking us." We set to work, using the tools and materials I'd gathered to reinforce the cabin's weak points. The single door received most of our attention. We braced it with a heavy wooden beam and stacked firewood against it for additional support. The windows, already small, were covered with spare boards nailed into place, leaving only narrow gaps for observation. As we worked, Brian's condition continued to deteriorate. His breathing became more labored, and despite Kit's best efforts, the strange, precise cuts on his body refused to clot properly. "He's trying to say something," Sam called suddenly. We gathered around the bunk where Brian had regained a moment of consciousness, his eyes glassy but determined as he struggled to form words. "It learns," he managed, each word clearly causing him pain. "Not killing, studying." "What is it, Brian?" I asked gently. "What's out there?" His eyes found mine, filled with a terrible clarity. "Wrong. Shape, human, but wrong. Been watching. Campers. Hikers. Learning. I was first it caught." A violent shudder ran through his body, and Kit quickly administered another dose of medication. "Rest now," Kit urged. "Help is coming." Brian's hand shot out, grabbing Kit's sleeve. "No, listen. It copies. Better each time. First attempts, clumsy. But it learns fast." "Copies what?" Bridges asked, leaning closer. "Us," Brian whispered, his voice fading. "Our shape, our movements, getting better." His hand fell away as unconsciousness claimed him once more, leaving us to exchange troubled glances in the firelit cabin. "He's delirious," Sam suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. "Maybe," Bridges replied, "but something did this to him, something that left tracks unlike any animal I've ever seen." A sudden thump against the outer wall made us all jump. We froze, listening intently as the sound came again. A deliberate impact, followed by a slow scraping noise that traveled around the perimeter of the cabin. "It found us," Kit whispered. Bridges drew his sidearm, motioning for me to do the same. "Sam, stay with Kit and Brian. Alex, with me." We moved to the nearest window, peering through the narrow gap between the boards. The storm had intensified into a full blizzard, visibility reduced to swirling white just a few feet beyond the glass. Another thump came, this time from the opposite wall. "It's testing our defenses," I realized aloud, methodically. "Or trying to draw us out," Bridges countered, moving to check another window. The scraping continued, circling the cabin with deliberate slowness. When it reached the door, it stopped. For several long moments, nothing happened. Then came a new sound, a light rapping, almost like knuckles against wood, in a perfect imitation of a human knock. Sam stifled a gasp. None of us moved. The knocking came again, followed by something that turned my blood to ice, a voice halting and wrong, like someone learning to speak for the first time. "Help me, cold, out here." The voice was almost human, but with subtle distortions that made it profoundly unsettling. Vowels held too long, consonants clicked too sharply. "Is anyone there? Need help?" "It's mimicking," Kit whispered, using language it's heard. Bridges positioned himself by the door, weapon raised. No one responds. No one moves. The thing outside tried again, its voice subtly closer to natural human speech. "Search and rescue found me." Brian stirred on his bunk, agitated even in unconsciousness. Outside, the scraping resumed, moving away from the door and toward one of the shuttered windows. A shadow passed across the narrow gap, momentarily blocking the swirling snow from view. "It's trying to find a way in," I murmured, keeping my voice barely audible. For the next hour, we remained in tense silence as the entity circled the cabin, occasionally testing different entry points with increasing force. The attempts seemed less random over time, focusing on the structurally weaker areas we'd reinforced. Its learning curve was disturbingly rapid. During a brief lull in the entity's movements, Bridges attempted to reach base camp on the radio again. The storm interference was worse, but we managed to confirm that a ground team was still en route, though the blizzard was slowing their progress significantly. "ETA now 6 to 7 hours, Bridges informed us grimly. "We're on our own until dawn at least." As night fell completely, the cabin grew colder despite the fire. We took turns watching the windows and tending to Brian, whose condition continued to worsen. Around midnight, the scratching and thumping suddenly ceased. The silence that followed was almost more unnerving than the sounds had been. "Did it leave?" Sam whispered after nearly 30 minutes of quiet. "I doubt it," I replied, peering through a gap in the window boards. The storm had begun to ease, the snow falling more gently now, allowing glimpses of the moonlit clearing around the cabin. "It's too deliberate, too patient." "Maybe it's waiting for us to lower our guard," Kit suggested, replacing the cold compress on Brian's forehead. As if in response to his words, a new sound emerged from the darkness outside. A wet, grinding noise followed by a series of clicks that reminded me unsettlingly of bones being snapped and reassembled. It came from directly beneath the cabin's raised foundation. "It's under us," Sam breathed, her eyes wide. The floorboards creaked as something heavy moved beneath them, testing the underside of the cabin. We backed away from the sound, gathering protectively around Brian's bunk. "Options?" I asked Bridges, keeping my voice steady. "We hold position," he replied firmly. "Cabin's built on a solid foundation. It can't get through from below without tools." But even as he spoke, a splintering crack came from near the wood stove, and a floorboard visibly shifted upward, as if being pushed from below. Another board groaned nearby, then another. "It's stronger than it looks," Kit observed, his professional calm beginning to fray at the edges. Bridges made a quick decision. "Move Brian to the corner, away from the floor disturbance. Sam, Kit, stay with him. Alex, with me." We repositioned as directed, dragging Brian's bunk to the farthest corner, while Bridges and I took up defensive positions facing the buckling floorboards. The wood stove sat on a stone hearth, preventing access in that immediate area, but the surrounding floorboards continued to shift and crack. Suddenly, the pressure stopped. Complete silence fell once more, stretching for several agonizing minutes. "Maybe it," Sam began, but was cut off by a tremendous crash as something slammed into the roof above us. Dust and debris showered down as the impact reverberated through the cabin's structure. A second crash followed, then a third, each one more forceful than the last. The roof beams groaned under the assault. "It's trying to come through the roof now," I said, aiming my weapon upward. "Smart," Bridges muttered. We reinforced the walls and floor but couldn't reach the roof. Kit moved to check on Brian, who had begun to mutter and thrash despite his weakened state. "He's getting worse. Much worse." Between crashes on the roof, I heard Brian's fevered whispers. "Wrong shape. Learning. Becoming. Won't stop." Another tremendous impact sent a roof beam cracking, and a shower of snow and splinters rained down from a newly formed gap in the ceiling. Through the opening, I caught a glimpse of something moving against the night sky. A silhouette of impossible angles that my mind struggled to process. "Bridges!" I shouted, pointing upward. He raised his weapon and fired 2 shots through the gap. A shrill, inhuman sound echoed in response. Not quite a scream, but a noise of surprise and pain that set my teeth on edge. The attacks on the roof ceased immediately. "Did you hit it?" Sam asked, her voice tight with hope and fear. "I think so," Bridges replied, keeping his weapon trained on the ceiling. "But I don't think I killed it." "It's retreating," I observed, moving carefully to peer through one of the window gaps. In the moonlight filtering through breaking clouds, I could make out a dark shape moving away from the cabin, its gait uneven now, favoring one side. Its movements were jerky, almost mechanical, as it disappeared into the tree line. "We wounded it," Bridges confirmed, lowering his weapon slightly. "But it might come back. Stay alert." For the remainder of that long night, we maintained our vigil, taking turns to watch and rest. The entity did not return, but Brian's condition continued to deteriorate despite Kit's best efforts. By dawn, he had fallen into a coma-like state, his breathing shallow and irregular. The storm cleared with the morning light, revealing a landscape transformed by nearly 2 feet of fresh snow. Bridges made radio contact with the ground team, who reported they were less than an hour away. The news should have been a relief, but Brian's labored breathing told us he might not have even that long. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows through the trees, I stood at the window, scanning the forest edge for any sign of our nocturnal visitor. The pristine snow showed no tracks. Either it hadn't returned, or it had found ways to move without leaving evidence. "Movement at the tree line," Sam called suddenly, pointing to the northeast corner of the clearing. We tensed, weapons ready, but the figures that emerged from the forest were unmistakably human. The ground rescue team, 5 strong, making their way through the deep snow toward the cabin. "They made it," Kit breathed, the relief evident in his voice. Bridges radioed to confirm their identity, and moments later, we were helping them through the door, explaining the situation in urgent tones as they set up emergency medical equipment. The team's senior paramedic took one look at Brian and immediately called for a priority evacuation. "He's going into systemic shock. We need to get him to the hospital immediately." As they prepared Brian for transport, I pulled Bridges aside. "What do we tell them about what we saw?" Bridges glanced at the rescue team, then back to me. "The truth. Something attacked our hiker and then came after us. We wounded it, and it retreated." He paused. "But we keep our speculation to ourselves for now. Let the sheriff's department investigate." I nodded, though the decision sat uneasily with me. Whatever had stalked us through the forest, whatever had systematically cut and studied Brian Vasquez, was still out there, and based on what we'd witnessed, it was learning, adapting, becoming more dangerous with each encounter. As we emerged from the cabin into the bright morning light, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched from the distant trees. The Forest Service would investigate, of course. They might even close this section of the park temporarily. But eventually, hikers would return, Campers would pitch their tents, and whatever hunted in these shadows would be waiting, patient, curious, and getting better at pretending to be human with each passing day. The extraction team worked with practiced efficiency, transferring Brian onto their specialized stretcher, while their lead paramedic, a stone-faced woman named Joanna, established an IV line and monitored his vitals. The rest of us gathered our equipment and prepared to leave the cabin that had been both our prison and salvation through the long night. "Blood pressure's dangerously low," Joanna announced, her voice clinically detached. "Pulse irregular. Let's move quickly, people." Outside, the morning revealed the full extent of the storm's impact. Pristine snow blanketed the clearing around the cabin, untouched except for the rescue team's approach trail. The forest beyond stood silent and watchful, the trees heavy with white. "Any sign of whatever attacked him?" asked Mike, one of the rescue team members, as he helped secure Brian to the stretcher. "Not since last night," Bridges replied carefully, "but stay alert. We're not certain it's gone." I scanned the tree line as we stepped away from the cabin, searching for any disturbance in the perfect white landscape. Nothing moved except occasional clumps of snow falling from overburdened branches. "We've got snowmobiles waiting at the eastern trail junction," Joanna informed us, "about a mile from here. Can you make the hike?" We nodded, though exhaustion weighed heavy on all of us after the sleepless night. The rescue team had brought additional equipment, snowshoes, energy packs, and 2 rifles that they distributed without comment. Whatever Bridges had told them over the radio had clearly conveyed the seriousness of our situation. Our journey back was slow and tense, with 2 team members carrying Brian's stretcher while the rest of us formed a protective perimeter. The deep snow made progress difficult, and Brian's condition required frequent stops for Joanna to check his status and adjust medications. "Did you get a good look at it?" Mike asked me quietly during one such pause, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest. "Whatever did this to him?" I hesitated, unsure how to describe what we'd seen. "Not clearly. It moved fast, stayed in the shadows." "Bear? Mountain lion?" I shook my head. "Neither. Something different." Mike's expression tightened, but he asked no further questions. The unspoken fear that had gripped our group now extended to the rescue team, their experienced eyes catching the unusual damage to the cabin's roof and the strange pattern of Brian's wounds. About halfway to the snowmobiles, Kit called a halt. Brian's breathing had become more labored, and Joanna needed to intubate him to maintain his airway. As they worked, the rest of us formed a tight circle around them, facing outward toward the surrounding trees. That's when I noticed it, a subtle wrongness in the forest's geometry, a shadow that didn't quite match the tree casting it. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving me to question whether fatigue had caused me to imagine it. "Did you see that?" Sam whispered beside me, her rifle trained on the same spot. My pulse quickened. "Northwest edge, about 50 yards in." She nodded almost imperceptibly. "It moved wrong." I caught Bridges' attention with a subtle gesture, indicating the direction without making any obvious movements. He understood immediately, shifting his position to cover that section of forest while keeping his expression neutral to avoid alerting whatever might be watching us. "Patient stabilized," Joanna announced. "Let's move." We resumed our careful trek, now hyper-aware of our surroundings. Twice more I caught glimpses of something pacing us through the trees, never clearly visible but unmistakably present. It maintained a consistent distance, never approaching but never falling behind, as if studying our group dynamics. "It's observing us," I murmured to Bridges when we paused to adjust Brian's stretcher. "Learning." "I know," he replied grimly. "But it seems wary after last night. The gunshots must have hurt it." "Or taught it to be more cautious," I countered. When we finally reached the trail junction, the sight of the waiting snowmobiles brought a wave of relief that was almost physical. The rescue team quickly secured Brian to a specialized transport sled while Joanna continued to monitor his vital signs. 3 machines, 9 people, Mike calculated. "We'll have to double up. Medical team with the patient, the rest distributed for balance." As we organized ourselves, I noticed Sam staring intently into the forest, her body tense. "Alex," she called softly. 10 o'clock, just beyond that fallen pine." I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. There it was, not hiding now, but standing partially exposed at the edge of a small clearing. In the daylight, its wrongness was even more apparent. It had the rough shape of a human, but proportioned all wrong, limbs too long and jointed in impossible ways, its body unnaturally thin. Its skin, if you could call it that, was a mottled gray-brown that seemed to shift and adjust to match its surroundings. Most disturbing was its face, or rather its lack of one. Where features should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless surface with subtle indentations where eyes might eventually form. "Everyone on the snowmobiles. Now," Bridges ordered quietly, his gaze fixed on the entity. "No sudden movements." We complied, carefully distributing ourselves among the machines. I ended up behind Mike on the lead snowmobile, with Bridges and Sam on the second, and the medical team with Brian on the third with its attached transport sled. The entity hadn't moved, remaining perfectly still as it observed our preparations. There was an awful intelligence in its posture, a calculating patience that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. "Ready?" Mike asked once everyone was positioned. "We go together, maintain formation." The snowmobiles roared to life in unison, the noise shattering the forest's silence. The entity reacted instantly, its body contorting in a fluid motion as it retreated several steps into deeper cover, not fleeing, but adjusting its position. "Go!" Bridges shouted, and Mike gunned the engine. We shot forward along the trail, the other snowmobiles close behind. I glanced back in time to see the entity step fully into the clearing, its head tilted in what looked disturbingly like curiosity. Then it moved, not running exactly, but flowing through the snow with unnatural speed, paralleling our course through the trees. "It's following," I shouted to Mike, who nodded tersely, and increased our speed. The forest blurred around us as we raced along the trail, snow spraying in our wake. I kept my eyes on the tree line, catching occasional glimpses of our pursuer keeping pace with unsettling ease. It moved with growing confidence, its gait becoming smoother, more efficient with each passing moment, as if it were learning how to move better simply by watching us. After several tense minutes, we broke free of the denser forest into a wider fire road that led toward the main ranger station. The entity fell behind as we gained speed on the clearer path, eventually disappearing from view altogether. When we finally reached the ranger station, a flurry of activity awaited us. Sheriff's deputies had arrived along with additional medical personnel and a helicopter for emergency medical evacuation. Brian was quickly transferred to the waiting aircraft while Bridges conferred with the sheriff, gesturing occasionally toward the forest we'd just escaped. "You okay?" Sam asked, appearing at my side as I watched the helicopter lift off with Brian and the medical team. "I don't know," I admitted. "What we saw out there, I know." She ran a hand through her disheveled hair. "No one's going to believe us, are they?" Before I could respond, Bridges called us over to where he stood with Sheriff Morales, a stocky man with a perpetually serious expression. "I need your statements," Morales said without preamble. "All of you. Separately." The next few hours passed in a blur of debriefings, medical checks, and paperwork. I described what we'd encountered as accurately as possible, though I could see the skepticism in Morales' eyes as I detailed the entity's appearance and behavior. When I finished, he simply nodded and made a few additional notes. "We'll be sending a team to investigate the cabin and surrounding area," he informed me. "Forest Service is closing that section of the park pending our findings." "Sheriff," I said as he prepared to leave, "whatever's out there, it's dangerous in ways we don't understand yet." Morales paused, studying me for a moment. "We'll handle it, Reeves. Wildlife experts are being consulted. If there's a predator in those woods, we'll find it." But as he walked away, I knew he hadn't really understood. He was looking for a known quantity, a bear, a mountain lion, maybe even a human assailant. Not something that defied categorization. Something that learned and adapted with frightening speed. Late that afternoon, we received word that Brian had been stabilized at the regional hospital. His prognosis remained uncertain. Extensive blood loss, trauma, and the strange infections developing in his wounds created a complex medical challenge. The doctors were particularly puzzled by the systematic nature of his injuries, which one surgeon described as almost surgical in precision. That evening, the four of us, Bridges, Kit, Sam, and myself, gathered in a quiet corner of the ranger station break room, nursing cups of coffee and processing the events of the past 24 hours. The sheriff thinks it was a bear, Sam said, breaking the silence. I overheard him talking to his deputies. They're organizing a hunt. They won't find a bear, Kit replied quietly, or any animal we've classified. Bridges stared into his coffee cup. I've put in requests for trail cameras throughout that section of the forest. If it's still out there, we might get something on film. And then what? I asked. What if we do capture an image of it? Who do we even report that to? No one had an answer. We sat in contemplative silence until Bridges' phone rang. He stepped away to take the call, returning a few minutes later with a grim expression. That was the hospital, he informed us. Brian's awake. He's asking to speak with us. Specifically, the team that found him. Says it's urgent. We drove to the hospital in Bridges' SUV, the tension in the vehicle palpable. None of us knew what to expect. But Brian's insistence on speaking with us suggested he had information he hadn't been able to share before. The hospital was a modern facility at the edge of town, its windows glowing warmly against the gathering dusk. We were directed to the ICU, where a doctor met us outside Brian's room. He's still in critical condition, she warned us. His vital signs are stabilizing, but he's extremely weak. Keep it brief. Brian lay surrounded by monitors and IV lines, his skin almost as white as the sheets covering him. The systematic cuts that covered his body were now hidden beneath bandages, but the memory of their precise pattern remained vivid in my mind. His eyes opened as we entered, bright with fever but lucid. You came, he whispered, his voice barely audible. We're here, Brian, Bridges assured him, moving closer to the bed. The doctor says we can't stay long. Brian nodded weakly. Need to tell you what I learned. He paused, gathering strength. It's been in these woods for months, watching, learning. What is it? Kit asked gently. Where did it come from? Don't know origin, Brian replied. But I know. Purpose. It told me while it worked. A chill ran through me. It spoke to you? Not at first. It learned language. From watching campers. From my screams. His breathing hitched, and one of the monitors beeped in response. It's studying us, our bodies, how we're made, how we move, how we think. Why? Sam asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Brian's gaze shifted to her. To become like us. Perfect mimicry. He swallowed painfully. It's getting better. Each time, better approximation. The cuts on your body, I said, understanding dawning. It was mapping you, learning your anatomy. He nodded, wincing with the effort. Started with animals. Dissected them. Studied them. I was first human subject. His eyes filled with tears. Not last. It's still learning. Still needs more subjects. We wounded it, Bridges told him. I shot it when it attacked the cabin. A ghost of a smile touched Brian's lips. Good, but won't stop it. It heals. Adapts. His expression grew more urgent. Listen carefully. It can't mimic perfectly yet. Still gets details wrong. That's how. You'll know. Know what? I asked. When it's pretending to be human, he whispered. When it walks among us. The monitor beside his bed began to beep more rapidly as his pulse elevated. The doctor appeared in the doorway. That's enough. He needs rest. As we prepared to leave, Brian grasped my wrist with surprising strength. Subtle wrongness, he hissed. Movements too smooth or too jerky. Eyes don't blink right. And cold, always cold to touch. The doctor ushered us out as nurses moved in to stabilize Brian. We stood in the hallway processing his warnings. He's been through severe trauma, Kit said after a moment. Fever, shock, medication, all could contribute to delusions or hallucinations. You saw that thing, Sam countered. We all did. It wasn't human. But becoming human, Bridges mused. That's a significant leap from what we observed. I remained silent, recalling the entity's behavior, its rapid learning, its systematic approach, the way it had studied our movements and attempted to mimic human speech. Brian's warning resonated with a terrible logic. As we left the hospital, the sun had fully set, casting the surrounding forest into impenetrable darkness. I found myself studying the shadows between streetlights, suddenly hyper-aware of every oddly shaped silhouette. "What now?" Sam asked as we reached Bridges' SUV. Bridges considered for a moment. "We report everything to Forest Service headquarters, request additional resources for the investigation, and we warn our teams to be extremely cautious in that section of the forest." "Will that be enough?" I pressed. "It has to be," he replied, though his expression betrayed his doubt. "Until we have concrete evidence of whatever this is, our options are limited." As we drove back to the ranger station, I stared out at the dark mass of the forest that surrounded our town. Somewhere in those trees, something was watching, learning, becoming. And I couldn't shake the feeling that our encounter was just the beginning of a much larger and more terrifying story. 2 weeks passed since our encounter in the forest. Brian Vasquez remained hospitalized, his condition slowly improving, though the doctors remained puzzled by the unusual healing patterns of his wounds. The sheriff's department conducted their investigation, finding nothing more than some unusual tracks that they attributed to a previously undocumented predator, possibly a bear with deformities. The case was left open, but inactive. For those of us who had been there, however, life had irrevocably changed. I found myself unable to look at the forest the same way. During routine patrols, I'd catch myself scanning the trees for unnatural movements, for shadows that didn't quite match their surroundings. Sleep became elusive, punctuated by dreams of elongated limbs and methodical cuts. Bridges had ordered trail cameras installed throughout the eastern section of the forest, despite budget concerns from regional headquarters. So far, they had captured nothing unusual. Plenty of deer, the occasional bear or mountain lion, but nothing that matched what we had seen. The entity, it seemed, had either moved on or grown wise enough to avoid detection. Sam and I had taken a meeting for coffee before shifts, comparing notes and observations. Neither of us said it aloud, but I knew we both found comfort in confirming that the other still believed what we had witnessed. "I checked on Brian yesterday," Sam told me during one such meeting, stirring her coffee absently. "He's doing better physically, but he's different." "Different how?" I asked. She frowned, searching for the right words. "Hypervigilant. He watches everyone who enters his room with this intense scrutiny. Keeps asking the nurses to move in certain ways, to speak certain phrases. Like he's testing them." I understood immediately. He's looking for imposters, for signs that someone isn't who they appear to be. "Exactly," she nodded. "The doctors think it's PTSD or some form of trauma-induced paranoia. But you and I know better." I did know better, and that knowledge weighed heavily. The Forest Service had reopened the closed section after a cursory investigation found no ongoing threat, and hikers were once again venturing onto those trails, unaware of what might be watching them from the shadows. That afternoon, I was reviewing maps in the office when Bridges called me into his private office. He closed the door behind me, his expression grave. "We got something," he said without preamble, turning his laptop to face me. "From camera 7 near the ravine where we found Brian." The footage was grainy and dark, a night shot illuminated only by the camera's infrared capability. For several seconds, nothing moved in the frame. Then, at the edge of the camera's range, something tall and thin emerged from behind a tree. Its movements were too fluid, too precise, as it glided across the forest floor without disturbing a single branch. As it approached the camera, its features became clearer: the two long limbs, the disproportionate torso, the smooth, featureless face. But something had changed since we last saw it. Its shape was more refined, its proportions closer to human norm, though still unmistakably wrong. It paused directly before the camera, head tilting in that unsettling gesture of curiosity. Then, slowly and deliberately, it raised a hand toward the lens. The fingers were too long, too jointed, but they moved with increasing dexterity as they reached out, and the footage went dark. "It disabled the camera," Bridges said quietly. "Purposefully." It knew what the camera was, I realized. It understood it was being watched. Bridges nodded grimly. That's not all. 2 hikers were reported missing yesterday, last seen heading into the Eastern Trail system. My stomach dropped. Search party? Assembling now. I want you on it, but... He hesitated. I understand if you'd prefer not to go back out there. I'm going, I said immediately. Someone needs to know what we're potentially dealing with. Bridges looked relieved. Good. Sam and Kit are already gearing up. This time we're going better prepared. Better prepared turned out to mean a 6-person team, all armed, with additional Forest Service rangers from neighboring districts who had been briefed on a potential unknown predator. No one explicitly mentioned our encounter with the entity, but the tension in the air as we gathered at the trailhead spoke volumes. Last confirmed sighting was at the Crystal Lake campground, Bridges explained, pointing to the location on our maps. Mark and Elaine Wilson, both experienced hikers, both in their early 30s. They were supposed to check in with friends yesterday evening by satellite phone. When they didn't, their emergency contact called it in. Any signs of disturbance at their campsite? Asked Ranger Powell, a veteran from the Northern District. Unknown, Bridges replied. We're the first response team. Sheriff's Department is assembling their own search party but won't be on site for at least 3 hours. We moved out in pairs, maintaining visual contact as we followed the trail toward Crystal Lake. The day was overcast, occasional drops of rain pattering on the canopy above us. The forest felt oppressively quiet, just as it had during our search for Brian. Sam walked beside me, her eyes constantly scanning our surroundings. You feel it too, don't you? She murmured. Like we're being watched. I nodded, unwilling to voice my growing unease. Every shadow seemed to harbor potential threat, every rustle of leaves a possible sign of that unnatural presence. We reached the Wilsons' campsite just after noon. At first glance, everything appeared normal. A 2-person tent properly set up, cooking equipment neatly arranged. Backpacks hung from a tree branch to keep them away from wildlife. It was only upon closer inspection that the wrongness became apparent. The tent, Kit said, crouching beside it. Look at these seams. Where the fabric panels connected, someone, or something, had carefully picked apart the stitching in small sections, as if examining how the pieces fit together. The same methodical exploration was evident in other items. A hiking boot with its laces removed and precisely rethreaded in an incorrect pattern. A compass that had been disassembled and reassembled with subtle errors. It's learning how things are constructed, I said quietly. Material objects this time, not just biology. Bridges directed the team to spread out and search the perimeter while maintaining visual contact. Any sign of the Wilsons is priority 1, he reminded everyone. But stay alert, and together. Sam and I took the western edge of the clearing, carefully checking for tracks or disturbances in the undergrowth. About 20 yards from the campsite, Sam stopped abruptly. Alex, she called softly, look at this. On the ground before us lay a walking stick, standard equipment for many hikers. But this one had been altered. Sections had been carefully carved away to reveal its internal structure, and strange symbols had been etched into the wood. Not random scratches, but precise patterns that reminded me uncomfortably of the systematic cuts on Brian's body. It's getting more sophisticated, I murmured. More intentional. A shout from the eastern perimeter drew our attention. We hurried to join the others who had gathered around a disturbing discovery. A trail of personal items leading away from the campsite. A watch, a glove, a hat, each placed deliberately, as if marking a path. It's leading us somewhere, Kit said, voicing what we were all thinking. Or leading us into a trap, Ranger Powell countered, his hand resting on his sidearm. Bridges considered our options briefly. We follow, but with extreme caution. Powell, you and Chen take rear guard. Alex and Sam with me on point. Martin and Lopez maintain the middle. Radio contact continuous. We proceeded along the trail of items, each one placed just within sight of the last, creating an unmistakable path deeper into the forest. The items became increasingly personal. A wallet containing ID confirming it belonged to Mark Wilson, a necklace that presumably was Elaine's, a torn page from a journal. The path led us to a small ravine similar to where we had found Brian, but the scene that awaited us there was both better and worse than what I had feared. The Wilsons were alive, both of them, huddled together at the base of a large boulder. They appeared physically unharmed, but deeply traumatized, their eyes wide with terror as we approached. "Forest Service search and rescue," Bridges called out, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Mark, Elaine, we're here to help you." Mark Wilson's head snapped up, his expression wild. "Stay back," he shouted. "It might look like you, but it's not you." We halted our approach, exchanging concerned glances. "Mr. Wilson," Bridges tried again, "we're real people here to bring you to safety. Can you tell us what happened?" Elaine whispered something to her husband, who kept his distrustful gaze fixed on us. "Prove it," he demanded. "Prove you're human." Kit stepped forward slowly. "We understand why you're afraid. Something found you in the woods, didn't it? Something that wasn't quite right." The couple's reaction confirmed our suspicions. Elaine began to weep silently while Mark's face contorted with remembered horror. "It watched us," he said finally, "for hours. Just standing at the edge of our campsite. When I approached it, thinking it was a lost hiker, it changed, moved wrong, spoke with our voices, phrases it had heard us say to each other. It herded us here," Elaine added, her voice barely audible. "Not chasing, but manipulating our movements, blocking certain paths, leaving others open. It was studying our responses." "Did it hurt you?" Kit asked gently. Mark shook his head. "No, it just observed, asked questions in this horrible approximation of human speech, wanted to know how we worked, how we thought, how we felt fear." A cold weight settled in my stomach. The entity was evolving in its approach, no longer just dissecting to understand physical structure, but now studying emotional and psychological responses as well. "It's safe now," Bridges assured them. "We're going to get you out of here. Can you walk?" They nodded, though neither seemed eager to move from their position against the boulder. As Bridges and Kit approached to help them up, I scanned our surroundings, suddenly acutely aware that we might be being watched at that very moment. A flicker of movement caught my eye, something shifting behind a cluster of pines about 30 yards away. I turned slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might draw attention from the others. There it stood, more human-like than before, its proportions closer to normal, though still subtly wrong. It watched our rescue operation with that same tilted head posture of intense curiosity. As I stared, it became aware of my attention. For a long, terrible moment, we regarded each other across the distance. Then, with deliberate slowness, it raised a hand in what could only be described as a wave, a perfect mimicry of a human greeting gesture. The message was clear. "I see you seeing me. I am learning." "Bridges," I called softly, not taking my eyes from the entity. 3 o'clock by the pine cluster. Bridges turned slowly, his hand moving to his weapon. The others followed his gaze, including the Wilsons, who shrank back in renewed terror. "Everyone stay calm," Bridges instructed. "Powell, Lopez, cover our retreat. The rest of you, get the Wilsons moving toward the trail, slowly." As our group began to withdraw, the entity remained motionless, watching our coordinated movement with apparent fascination. It made no attempt to follow or intervene, content, it seemed, to observe our response to its presence. We backed away carefully until the entity was no longer visible through the trees. Only then did we turn and move more quickly toward the main trail, supporting the Wilsons who, despite their lack of physical injuries, seemed drained of strength. The hike back to the trailhead passed in tense silence, broken only by necessary communication and the occasional sob from Elaine Wilson. We maintained formation around the couple, weapons ready, though no pursuit materialized. When we finally reached the vehicles, the sheriff's search party was just arriving. Bridges gave them a truncated version of events, emphasizing the presence of an unknown predator, without elaborating on its nature. The Wilsons were transferred to an ambulance for evaluation, though they clung to each other and refused to be separated. As the area buzzed with activity, Sam pulled me aside. "It didn't attack them," she said quietly. "It could have, but it didn't." "Why?" I considered this. Brian said it was learning. Maybe physical dissection is only one way it gathers information. So now it's studying behavior, psychology, social dynamics. It's evolving its approach, I replied grimly, getting more sophisticated in its information gathering. Our conversation was interrupted by Bridges, who gestured for us to join him by his vehicle, away from the others. The Wilsons gave a preliminary statement, he informed us in a low voice. They said the entity spoke to them, using phrases and words it had apparently learned from various sources. According to Mark, it asked questions about human relationships, emotions, how people make decisions under stress. It's trying to understand how we think, Kit said, joining our huddle. Not just how our bodies work, but our minds too. There's more, Bridges continued. Elaine says it showed them something, a crude approximation of a human face it was developing. Asked them if it was correct. A chill ran through me. It's getting better at mimicry. And asking for feedback on its progress, Sam added, horror evident in her voice. Bridges looked at each of us in turn, his expression grave. We need to bring this to the regional director. This goes beyond a standard predator situation. Will they believe us? Kit asked what we were all thinking. Without concrete evidence, this sounds insane, I finished for him. We need proof. The trail camera footage, Sam suggested. Bridges nodded. It's a start. And the Wilson statement, plus Brian's, it's thin, but it's something. As we dispersed to complete our duties, I found myself drawn to the edge of the parking area, staring back at the forest we had just emerged from. The trees stood silent and imposing, revealing nothing of what might lurk within their shadows. That night, I couldn't sleep. Images of the entity's wave, that deliberate, learned gesture of human acknowledgement, kept replaying in my mind. I tried to make sense of what we were dealing with to fit it into some framework of understanding, but came up empty. Whatever this thing was, it existed outside our normal classifications of threat and danger. The next morning brought news that the regional director would be arriving to personally review our evidence and reports. The atmosphere at the ranger station was tense, a mix of anticipation and dread. Those who hadn't witnessed the entity firsthand remained skeptical, viewing our accounts with poorly concealed doubt. Director Hernandez arrived just before noon, a tall, no-nonsense woman with 3 decades of Forest Service experience. Bridges ushered her into the conference room where we had assembled our evidence, the trail camera footage, photographs of the altered items from the Wilsons' campsite, medical reports on Brian's unusual injuries, and detailed statements from all witnesses. For nearly 2 hours, Hernandez reviewed everything in silence, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but offering no indication of her thoughts. When she finally spoke, her tone was measured and careful. To be clear, she began, looking at each of us in turn. You believe there is an unknown entity in Cibola National Forest that is systematically studying humans for the purpose of mimicking us? An entity that is not only intelligent, but apparently learning at an accelerated rate? Put that way, it sounded absurd, but we nodded nonetheless. The evidence is concerning, she admitted, particularly the medical reports and the trail camera footage, but it's far from conclusive. With respect, Director, I interjected, we've all seen this thing. It's real, and it's dangerous in ways we don't fully understand yet. Hernandez considered me for a moment. I'm not dismissing your experiences, Ranger Reeves, but I need more before I can authorize the kind of response this situation would warrant if confirmed. More? Sam asked incredulously. People have been attacked, traumatized. What more do you need? Definitive evidence, Hernandez replied calmly. Something that can't be explained away as an unknown animal species or a human perpetrator with unusual methods. Bridges leaned forward. Director, I understand your position, but while we wait for definitive evidence, this entity is evolving its approach. The Wilsons weren't physically harmed because it's moved beyond simple anatomical study. It's learning how to act human, how to blend in. The threat is escalating. Hernandez was silent for a long moment. Here's what I can do, she said finally. I'll authorize increased patrols in the affected areas, additional trail cameras with improved capabilities, and a temporary advisory for hikers to avoid solo trips in the eastern section. I'll also put our wildlife biology team on alert to analyze any new evidence immediately. It wasn't everything we'd hoped for, but it was something. As the meeting disbanded, Hernandez pulled me aside. "Off the record, Reeves," she said quietly. "I've been in these forests for 30 years. I've seen things that don't make easy sense. Things I've never reported because there wasn't a framework to report them in. I'm not dismissing what you and your team experienced." I studied her face, seeing a glimmer of understanding I hadn't expected. "But you need more before you can act officially." She nodded. "Bureaucracy requires evidence, but be careful out there. Whatever this is, don't underestimate it." The following days brought increased activity to our normally quiet station. Additional rangers were deployed, wildlife experts consulted, trail cameras upgraded and repositioned. The eastern section of the forest remained open, but with prominent advisories about traveling in groups and reporting unusual sightings immediately. Brian Vasquez was released from the hospital into psychiatric care, his physical wounds healing but his mental state still fragile. The Wilsons declined further interviews and reportedly moved away from the area entirely. Life began to resume a strained normalcy, though those of us who knew the truth remained vigilant. A week after Director Hernandez's visit, I was reviewing footage from the new trail cameras when I noticed something odd on camera 12, positioned near a popular hiking trail just outside the area where we'd encountered the entity. A figure stood at the edge of the frame, partially obscured by foliage. At first glance, it appeared to be a normal hiker, but something about its posture caught my attention. I enhanced the image and felt my blood run cold. Though mostly concealed, what was visible of the figure showed subtle wrongness. Proportions that were close to human but not quite right, movements that were too smooth as it observed passing hikers from its hidden vantage point. As I watched, a group of 3 hikers passed along the trail, unaware of the observer in the trees. The entity remained perfectly still until they had passed, then emerged slightly from cover to watch them continue down the path. Its mimicry had improved dramatically. From a distance and partially obscured, it could easily be mistaken for human. I immediately called Bridges, who arrived within minutes to review the footage. "It's moving closer to populated areas," he observed grimly, testing its improved camouflage. "We need to close that trail," I insisted. "All the trails in that section." Bridges nodded. "I'll call Hernandez. This might be the evidence she needs." But even as we acted, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already behind in this deadly game of adaptation and evolution. The entity was learning, improving, advancing toward a goal we could only guess at. Each encounter revealed a creature more adept at approximating humanity. How long before its mimicry became perfect? How long before it could walk among us undetected, gathering information not from terrorized victims in the forest, but from casual conversations in town? The thought kept me awake at night, scanning the faces of strangers for signs of subtle wrongness. 2 days later, we closed all trails within a 3-mile radius of the sightings, citing wildlife management operations to avoid panic. Additional personnel were brought in, including experts from various fields who had been briefed on the situation. Camera coverage was expanded, and regular patrols established a perimeter around the affected area, and still, the entity remained one step ahead. Cameras would be found disabled or repositioned. Patrols would report strange sounds or glimpses of movement, but never make direct contact. It was learning our patterns, our methods, while we struggled to understand its basic nature. On a cold morning in late October, exactly 1 month after our first encounter with the entity, I joined a specialized team tasked with placing advanced monitoring equipment deeper in the forest. As we worked, the familiar feeling of being watched crept over me. I scanned the surrounding trees, seeing nothing out of place, yet unable to shake the sensation. We finished our work as the early dusk. This is an encounter I experienced back in the winter of 2013. My parents had just purchased a secluded cabin in the eastern Appalachian Mountains, seeking solitude after decades of urban life. The property sprawled across 7 acres of densely wooded terrain, with a winding gravel driveway that stretched nearly a mile from what locals generously called the main road. Our nearest neighbor lived approximately 2 miles away, as a crow would fly, but almost 5 miles by the actual mountain roads. The cabin itself was a sturdy 2-story structure, perched on the northern slope of the mountain, with large windows designed to capture the breathtaking valley views. During daylight hours, the panorama was indeed magnificent. As night fell, however, those same windows transformed into black mirrors, reflecting only the interior lights, while the surrounding forest disappeared into absolute darkness. My parents had begun the arduous process of relocating from their suburban home. They planned to make several trips to transport their belongings rather than hiring professional movers, partly to save money and partly because the remote location made larger moving trucks impractical on the narrow mountain roads. By mid-January, they had completed about half the move. My father needed to return to the city to finalize some paperwork with his former employer and collect the remaining essentials they'd need for the winter months. My mother had intended to accompany him, but I volunteered to stay at the cabin instead. I was 28 then, between jobs, and thought the solitude might help me reflect on my next career move. "Call us if anything comes up," my father said as he prepared to leave. "Cell reception is spotty, but the landline should work fine." "I'll be back tomorrow evening," my mother added, embracing me before following my father to their truck. "There's plenty of food in the freezer. Just be careful with the generator if the power goes out." I waved from the porch as their headlights disappeared down the winding driveway, watching until the rumble of their engine faded into silence. That was when the true weight of the isolation first settled over me. The wind whispered through the bare tree branches, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the gathering dusk. I stepped back inside, securing the deadbolt with an instinctive twist. The evening passed uneventfully. I heated a frozen lasagna, browsed through some old magazines my parents had brought, and eventually settled on the living room couch with my laptop to watch a downloaded movie since the internet connection hadn't yet been established. The cabin's heating system functioned efficiently, but I still maintained a fire in the wood stove, more for the comforting ambiance than actual warmth. By 11 o'clock, exhaustion began to overwhelm me. The physical labor of helping my parents move boxes earlier that day, combined with the mountain elevation, left me ready for sleep. I secured the fire screen in front of the dying embers, checked that all doors were locked, and retreated to the first-floor guest bedroom where I'd temporarily set up residence. The room felt particularly peaceful. Moonlight filtered through thin curtains, casting silvery patterns across the simple furnishings. I changed into flannel pajamas, grateful for their warmth, and slipped beneath the heavy quilts. The unfamiliar creaks and settling noises of the cabin briefly kept me alert, but soon my consciousness began to drift. The first knock jolted me from deep sleep. My eyes snapped open as I struggled to orient myself in the unfamiliar darkness. The bedside clock glowed 1:17 a.m. in harsh red digits. I remained motionless, ears straining, wondering if I'd dreamed the sound. Then it came again. 3 distinct knocks against the front door's glass panel. Deliberate, forceful, unmistakable. My mind raced through possibilities. My parents returning unexpectedly, a neighbor with an emergency, but I hadn't heard a car approach, and visitors would surely call ahead given our remote location. The driveway's loose gravel announced vehicles well before they reached the house, and I'd heard nothing. The third series of knocks exceeded the previous in intensity, as though an impatient fist was demanding entry. The sound echoed through the cabin with alarming clarity. I sat upright, heart hammering against my ribs, as fear crystallized into certainty. Someone was at the door, and they shouldn't be. I reached for my phone but found no signal. The mountainous terrain blocked reception in my bedroom. The landline sat in the kitchen, requiring me to cross the main living area with its wall of windows facing the front porch. The thought of moving into visibility made my throat constrict with terror. Silence followed the third knock. I waited, lungs burning from held breath, listening for footsteps on the wooden porch. for the metallic sound of someone testing the doorknob. Nothing came except the house's ordinary nighttime sounds, the refrigerator's hum, the occasional crack from the cooling wood stove. 5 minutes passed according to the glowing bedside clock, then 10. My rational mind began suggesting explanations: a falling branch, an animal, the house settling and changing temperatures. Yet none could account for the deliberate, rhythmic quality of those knocks. I finally gathered enough courage to slide from beneath the covers. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight as I moved to the bedroom door, easing it open just enough to peer down the hallway toward the living room. Moonlight spilled through the front door's glass panels, illuminating a portion of the entryway. No shadows moved across the silvery light. No figure stood visible against the glass. With trembling fingers, I reached for the baseball bat my father had left propped in the corner, a precaution he'd insisted upon that now seemed desperately inadequate. I crept forward, each step carefully placed to minimize noise. The living room gradually came into view, empty, ordinary, bathed in the blue-white glow of moonlight on snow. I approached the front door, bat gripped tightly, and positioned myself to the side of the glass panels where I could glimpse the porch without being immediately visible. The wooden boards stretched empty in both directions. Fresh snow covered the steps leading down to the driveway, unmarked by footprints. This detail sent a wave of dread through me more intense than the knocking itself. The pristine snow meant whoever, or whatever had knocked, hadn't approached by conventional means. The only explanation was that someone had traveled through the dense forest, avoiding the driveway entirely, navigating steep terrain in darkness to reach our isolated cabin. I remained vigilant until dawn, positioned in the hallway where I could monitor both the front door and the rear entrance off the kitchen. The baseball bat rested across my knees as I sat with my back against the wall, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. The knocking never resumed, nor did any other sounds suggest the visitor remained. When the first gray light of morning finally appeared, I performed a careful inspection of the property. The snow around the cabin remained undisturbed except for animal tracks, deer and rabbits primarily. No human footprints marked the approaches to the doors or windows. Nothing appeared disturbed or damaged. Later that afternoon, when my parents returned, I recounted the experience. My father immediately checked the property again, this time venturing further into the woods than I had dared alone. He discovered nothing unusual except for a strange arrangement of broken branches about 50 yards into the forest that he insisted must have been caused by recent heavy snowfall. We installed motion-activated security cameras the following week. For months, I found myself startled awake at night, certain I'd heard knocking again, only to review empty footage the next morning. We never captured anything unusual on the cameras, yet during my subsequent visits to the cabin, I never again stayed there alone. What troubles me most isn't the absence of an explanation, but rather what might have happened had I answered the door. In my darkest moments, I'm grateful for the fear that kept me in bed, listening to those knocks gradually fade into the mountain's vast silence. Some visitors, I've come to believe, aren't meant to be received. Years have passed since that night. My parents still live in that cabin, having never experienced anything similar. Yet whenever I visit, I find myself listening more carefully after darkness falls, and I always check the locks twice before retiring to bed. The mountains keep their secrets well, and some questions are better left unanswered.